Good morning and welcome to the Electoral Area Services Committee for Thursday, July 21st, 2022. I'd like to call this meeting to order at 9:32 and acknowledge that the Sunshine Coast Regional District is located on the traditional territories of the Seashelt and Squamish Nations. We have an agenda in front of us today, a rather lengthy agenda in front of us today. Directors, do you have anything that you want to add to this agenda, or better yet, take off of this agenda? If not, I'll look for a motion to adopt the agenda as presented.
We're going to do it in a different order.
Oh. Sure. Director McMahon.
Sorry, you've caught me out here. I was going to suggest that we switch the order of some items and move up number 6 ahead of number 3.
Okay. So that'd be the DVP for Persephone to follow our delegation this morning. Okay. Any other changes, directors? Yes. If not, I look for a motion to adopt the agenda as amended. Moved, seconded, and all those in favor? Thank you very much. And can I have a motion to receive all reports and communications if there's any? Moved, seconded, all those in favor? Thank you. All right, so moving on to item number 2 in our agenda, we have Kathleen Sudis and Warren Hansen from the Sunshine Coast Community Forest regarding a community forest update. So we will turn it over to you guys.
Great, are we unmuted? Can you hear us?
We're unmuted.
Okay, great. So just getting this set up here to share the screen. Okay, great. Well, good morning. And I'd like to thank you for allowing us to present at this point in time. And I'd first like to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional homelands territories of the Seashelt Nation. My name is Kathleen Sudis, and I'm the chairperson for the Community Forest. And Warren Hansen is here with me today. He is, of course, our manager of forestry. So our main reason for being here today is we'd like to present to you basically an update as to what we're doing, how we're doing it, and what we're planning for the coming months. So harvesting from the community forest from 2021. You're looking at some of the numbers here. We harvested just over 15,000 cubic meters. It represented $2.9 million of value. 25% of that was sold to local mills and 75% sold to mills in the Lower Mainland. So that volume of timber would basically represent the wood used to build 14 average sized homes. And all of our harvesting, of course, was done with local contractors as well too. And you can see with regard to here with the graphics that we're sort of in that industrial roundwood community firewood program. We have our saw logs and veneer logs that go out for processing. And then of course we've got the pulpwood. So we're very much part of that supply chain. We're not processing or we're not shipping off raw logs anywhere. And also in 2021 and 2022, the community forest provided approximately $1.3 million towards the local economy by way of operational expenses, the contracting of local professionals, and various services. And of course, these endeavors, they would not be without the income generated from harvesting. So the economic activity is very much a process of our selling our timber. Also in throughout 2021, the Sunshine Coast Community Forest, we continue to support recreation and access for people throughout the community and to all areas of our community forest as best as we can. And here you can see some numbers of just some local in-kind donations. And of course, the Sunshine Coast Community Forest, where ecosystems-based management is a catalyst for our change. And I would just like to say that the Community Forest announced ecosystems-based management in April or May of about well, actually it was April of 2021. And for the last 14 months or so, it was, we've done an amazing amount of work. Oh, there we go. What happened? There we go. Thought we lost you. Anyway, so as I look back on all of the work that's been done over these months, I'm very, very proud of the very professional team that I have the privilege of sitting around a table with to make this happen. And that, and also the input from community, it's been a lot of work, and I really think that we're making headway and we're going somewhere. And I'm going to turn this over to Warren right now, because now we're going to sort of get into some of the details of EVM. And so we'll flip back and forth, but I'm going to pass the mic to Warren.
Yeah, appreciate it. For those who don't know me, my name is Warren Hansen. I'm the forester for the community forest. So a lot of things have happened over the last 12 to 15 months with EVM. We have a bi-weekly planning team where we go through different aspects of the EVM, as well as we're looking at community engagement, and that'll happen later on in the fall for going out to the community. So it's about trying to understand our community forests, and we completed a 10-year-wide assessment, and that's available on our website, where the blue and listed species may change. And then during this period, we're into a transitional period where, we're looking at our harvesting and how we can incorporate EVM principles within our blocks today. So we have, where it could be our future old growth reserves, and looking at sustainable harvesting, also address the atmospheric rain events or climate impacts that impact our community forest. So we're working towards that, and we want to be full EVM within the next year. So one of the first things that we are doing with EVM is really working on an ecosystem reserves, and that is that those ecosystem reserves are held for the long term as deferral areas, and they're really around foundation blocks of areas that we're set aside for riparian areas, old growth recruitment, recreation, a whole bunch of different things that we believe that the community finds important, and so we're trying to incorporate that first, and then get into how our operations will integrate into that. So that's kind of an interim step, and that's where we're at right now. We have a few blocks that we're planning for fall and winter this year. And we have, this year we just finished some harvesting in and around Trail Lake. We have the next blocks are a block called EW24, which is above the airport. That was a block that was selectively or commercially thinned as part of a training ground for our loggers back in the early 90s. And we're going to incorporate elements of EVM into that block as well. One of our other blocks is HM70. We've made substantial improvements based on our EVM planning team and our ecosystem assessments to really cut back from when we presented this plan last year to the SURD. We substantially reduced it by up to 60% of the original proposal. And then our last blocks are in and around above the Purpose Bay residence area. It's called AN15, 3 and 3A, a bit of a mouthful, but that is planned for winter, spring, actually 2023. I wanted to incorporate and show everyone, how we've adapted our plan to ecosystem-based management and what this would look like. So back in when this was originally proposed, the government announced old growth deferrals. A part of that initiative was to address old growth recruitment where there isn't enough old growth available in and around. It's typically around urban centers and areas where different highly, fire or historic harvesting has happened over the last 100 years. So this is a block. This is called HM70. We have identified through our EBM planning team, old growth recruitment, and that's shown in green here. And so we could show people, but basically this is the areas that this makes good old growth recruitment. It's empiric. It's an assessment that's been done by Air Force ecologists, and they said this needs to be set aside. Absolutely, we agree. We set that aside, modified our harvesting blocks. This is the timber that's inside our blocks, and quite a contrast. Very little complex stand structure. It's a very young forest, 60 years old versus something that's maybe 80 to 90 years old in this into the picture to the left. So this is kind of like we have a way of addressing and evaluating what makes good biodiversity, what makes good ecosystems. I'll turn it back to Kathleen. Thank you.
Thank you. I get to do all the soft stuff. He gets to do all the hard technical talk. But we're really, really proud. And that HM70, I mean, just as an example, I'll just quickly follow up. From the original start point we had a year ago looking at that block, we've now either deferred or reserved 60%. So that's, we're pretty excited. And that's how we see ourselves moving forward with these types of assessments. And each block, of course, is unique because of the tree age and the biodiversity and all those other things that go into play. But it's just an example of what we're striving for and where we're headed. So community engagement activities. Also back in that April 2021, we made a strong commitment to reboot our community engagement. And we realized that had been something that was lacking previously, and we needed to catch up. And we are on that path, and we've been pretty busy. So we've been continuing that momentum. As I say, a lot of effort into these engagement activities, and we're looking forward to an ambitious, positive, productive year as we move forward with community. We're starting to produce and support and participate with educational opportunities, receiving continued feedback and dialogue. We've got a highly successful Firewood Program. We do special events. We sponsored 6 Candace Campo Talking Trees initiatives. We're engaged with wetland restoration. We're engaged with research, including citizen science, which is pretty exciting, and lots more. It's been really fun. It's been a lot of work, and it's been really rewarding, and it's where we need to be. Also, this past summer, the Community Forest was able to host the Coastal Silviculture Conference. Lori Kremsutter, who is our lead biologist, she gave a presentation on old growth recruitment. All of these participants stayed in local B&Bs and hotels the time that they were here. The Botanical Gardens was the jewel in the crown when we had our evening event there. It was stunning. The weather was perfect, and it was just beautiful. Huge success. Really proud that we got to host that, and really proud that they chose the Sunshine Coast Community Forest for their first in-person conference workshop. So something to be proud of. Also, we're really proud to be able to participate and support with community grants and donations. The CIA reconciliation poll, we were able to provide the final additional funding to complete this. So we're very happy about that. And then community engagement. This is Alicia Lavache, she's the upper right, and then Rebecca Clady, lower left in the photos. They're both well qualified with the right skill set and the right backgrounds to be helping with us, but we've contracted with these 2 persons to help us develop a community engagement strategy to move forward with. That's something that's sustained, can be sustained, is meaningful and measurable. So again, we're really sort of pulling out all the stops and reinvesting in ourselves in a sense to make us something sustainable on the right path, and knowing that what we're doing is the right thing to be doing. They can be reached. There's an email there, community@sccf.ca, or just go through our website or just reach out to anybody if you need to connect with them. But they've been conducting interviews. They'll be developing our strategy with regard to any kind of community advisory panels as we move forward. So thank you very much. And I'm going to turn that over now for any kind of questions for either for Warren and I.
Great, thank you. And we'll just get you to stop your screen share.
Okay.
It done.
Hit what?
We did it.
We did? Okay.
Oh, stop share.
Oh, hang on. Where is that?
Right over there.
Oh, hang on.
I think I can do it here. There we go.
There you go. Thanks, Alison.
Directors,
Okay.
any questions for our community forest? Director Ties.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for the presentation, and I think this will be a good presentation for the next board when they start up. And I feel like, yeah, there was we weren't really introduced to the community forest, and we kind of had to gradually learn about it. So, if you can give a sort of a Cole's notes on what the community forest is and how you guys operate to the next board when they come in, I think that would be a great opportunity for a delegation again. So thank you for
Perfect.
that.
Our pleasure.
Thanks, Andreas.
Thank you. Director Hiltz.
Thanks, Chair, and yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. I was a question about the EBM. Is that, I guess, is there third-party certification or anything around that in terms of best practices, in terms of the value of the timber being harvested off this site? Does that process enhance the value of the timber for sale?
I'll let you respond to that one.
So EBM is being practiced on a larger scale in Haida Gwaii and the Great Bear Rainforest. There's not a lot, and so it's a voluntary process, honestly. Like other than if you're not practicing within those two large areas, everything you do down here is going to be voluntary. So for us, it's a management model in order to look at our area in a way that's never been done before. So our goals or our targets are like to leave fully functioning ecosystems, look at vulnerable ecosystems, look at opportunities for, and it also integrates humans and human interactions as part of that EBM process. So how humans are using our forest, how, what is the social engagement? And so there's kind of like a three-legged stool there. Sustainability, economics, and biodiversity. So there's and you're talking about is there a like a certification? No, there isn't. But there actually we have Lori Kremsetter and Anna Ewell from two forest ecologists and biologists that are helping us put together the sort of terms on what this is. And so it's really defined on our engagements with the community. It's really defined on what they find as being, sensitive ecosystems, and this is part of the sort of ecosystem reserves. And then it'll be, we'll be doing that certification ourselves, basically, and having the community hold us to task to it. So that's really that. There's much more of a community engagement and a community, and we have a citizens advisory panel that we're planning to initiate, and so that will be part of their terms of reference.
And also just to add in as well too, throughout all of this as well too is the EBM principle and practices also harmonizes with First Nation cultural and environmental. We're trying to harmonize ourselves as best as possible with those ideology and their planning and their cultural and land planning management, their future endeavors. So we're hoping that this all comes together like this nice tapestry that we can connect and have something wonderfully sustainable that benefits so many and move forward together for a future.
That's a mouthful. Sorry.
It is.
For sure. Director McMahon.
Right. I could happily talk about this half the morning, but we don't have half the morning. So I'm a big fan of citizen science. where do I go to find more information about citizen science opportunities with the community forest?
Honestly, I think community at sccf.ca, where we have been, we're looking at wildcam, how wildcam videos can help us understand where our flora and fauna is, understand, elk, or there could be salmon keepers as well. We look at, we have a couple of other citizen science that are looking at soils. Soil profiles before and after harvesting, and looking at how we can mitigate that and preserve our soils, and so there's lots of opportunities for citizen science. We are looking for people to collaborate with as well, and it's a bit of an organic process. And so Alicia and Rebecca should be addressing that and being able to bring those people that are interested in citizen science forward.
Thank you. Director Ties?
Yeah, thank you. I applaud the use of the EBM model, and I think that's something that should be sort of adopted by the whole province, if possible. So on that note, I'm kind of wondering if the community forest has any intention to maybe expand into some of the areas that are now governed by the province, whether it's through BC timber sales or other crown land. That's and because I would like to see that approach adopted rather than the current approach by the crown. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of respond briefly, and then Warren I'm sure will jump in. We would love to be able to expand. We would love to be able to take EBM model and expand it, because if we could do that, then we could actually look, seriously at things like carbon projects. We could look at connecting wildlife corridors. We could look at, it just gives us a bigger footprint to be able to put EBM into play where it's really quite functional. However, there is quite a process in expansion, and it's hopefully it'll be in our future, but I'll let Warren sort of respond from there, but there's quite a process involved.
Yeah, I mean, it is a process, and for really for any community forest to do any expansions is partnership with obviously the First Nations and partnerships with the community at large. And so really it's about, these things do take time. It involves possibly purchasing of area of forest license around, because if you expand in one area, you end up kicking out the other. And that's, and how do we mesh that? We've had overwhelming community support on expanding the community forest in and around different areas, and so we're and the community seeing that locally driven local contractors and having the benefits come back to the community is foremost. And so I think that there's a good message here, and I think for sure. I mean, that's something that's within our mandate to look at those opportunities in the near future. Yeah.
Thank you. Director Kroll.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity of visiting some of your cut blocks with Dave Lasser. And one of the things we noted at that time, and that was pre some of these major climate events we've had, stressing on certain species of trees from ostensibly drought. Also, we noted a lot of poaching had been going on. I'm just wondering, are you having to sort of rethink your planting policy with respect to some of these types of climate change?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's one thing that the Chief Forester, the Office of the Chief Forester has tasked, basically the whole industry. We are looking at doing things in a way that allows us to have, and you don't want to be, when you look at all the figures or whatever, we don't, their figures are saying, we don't want to be planting cedar, we want to be planting fir, and we're looking at opportunities and like, how can we have a better biodiversity in the ecosystem, within our plantations, and trying to address that sort of that climate change. It's, and if I could tell you what our weather's going to be like in 50 years, it is a bit of a conundrum, and we are addressing it through what we're doing for planting. I've noticed definitely the drought and it has stressed our ecosystems, our wetlands, our dry sites, where you have full cedar being killed off because of too warm of soils. And so we're trying to address that as best we can. Ecosystem based management helps us get there.
Thank you. Director Seegers?
Thank you. I just wanted to mention the Firewood Program. I know that Kathleen and Warren, mentioned that they're doing that, but I don't know if anybody's really aware of what it is. The community forest actually takes logs, and they're currently in our public works yard. They have groups that come in, including some from Skakel, and they buck up these logs into firewood, and then work with community services and other organizations in the community. And those who on the coast need firewood for heat in the winter, they get firewood provided to them. So it's, if that's their only method of heating, we want to make sure that they actually stay warm in the winter and have a reliable source of firewood. So that's something that the community forest proposed, and very successful program, and it really is impacting people's lives.
Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Director Ties?
Yeah, this is kind of a follow-up to my previous question, I guess. How does privately managed forest lands work into the equation? And is there any opportunity for the community forest to purchase them from the proceeds of their sales?
We'll see after the recession, Andrea. Forest land's very expensive, and we know that there's lots of forested land in and around our above Wilson Creek, a whole bunch of area around Half Moon Bay, and it's something that we've looked at, but the opportunity hasn't presented itself. So, but we are talking a substantial amount of money to be able to secure those privately held lands.
And it's something that we've absolutely had the conversation about this. We do look at possible future opportunities and how we can obtain that. So it's definitely on the table, but we're just not there right now.
Thank you. Director Seegers?
Thank you. Private managed forest is an actual name. Like people buy land and convert it to a private managed forest. So the District of Seashell, we actually have 2 private managed forests. One's up Tyler Road, one's up Seashell Inlet Road. So they're specific. They're owned by a person or a small group, and they have to manage it under a 15-year mandate. And District of Seashell Community Forest, we have nothing to say about it. Nothing to say about it. They can come in and clear cut it, and in fact did in one case, clear cut it, and we had nothing we could do about it. The community was up in arms. So private managed forest is different from the forest licenses that are out there, right? And those, so when they're talking about, does the community forest expand? What does that look like? That is an ongoing conversation with the First Nations as well, because any expansion would require consultation and collaboration.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that. I don't see any other hands up, so I think we will bid you farewell, and thank you for presenting today. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye now.
All right. Moving on in our agenda, we're going to go to Annex D, pages 353 to 363. And I will turn this over to Mr. Seau.
Thank you, Chair. So in 2019, SCRD issued a development variance permit to allow an increase of seating capacities from 30 people to 65 people for the food and beverage service lounge in Persephone Brewery. So operating hours of the lounge are one of the conditions of this permit. The conditions are registered in a covenant with the SCRD and are binding permanently once the lounge has been established. The permit and its conditions do not expire as long as the lounge and its operation exist. So since the establishment of the lounge, Persephone has experienced the need for longer operating hours and asked for an extension by 3 hours, making it to from 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. For the cool season from Thanksgiving Day to Victoria Day every year. So Persephone has implemented all other conditions of the permit. SCRD has not received any complaints since the issuance of the permit. The proposed extension of operating hours during the cool season does not alter the seating capacity granted by the permit, or other conditions such as vehicle and bike parking, restriction or amplifier, or outdoor music. So notifications of the proposed permit amendment and ways to give feedback, including attendance of today's meeting, were sent to about 17 neighboring residents on properties within 100 meters of the brewery. And no response had been received. Staff recommend approval of this permit amendment by modifying the operating hours in the covenant. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Seau. Having heard staff's introduction of the proposed development variance permit amendment, if there's anybody in the audience wishing to speak to the application, we ask that you raise your hand, and I'll ask you to speak in the order of hands raised. When you speak, please give your full name for the record. In order to keep our meeting moving, we ask that you please keep your comments focused and limit them to 3 minutes. Once the committee has heard from all those wishing to speak, we'll proceed with a motion and discussion towards recommendation to the board. So with that, is there anybody that wishes to speak? All right. Then I look to my directors. Comments, questions? Director Seegers?
Thank you. This would be for staff. Is it common to register this type of article on title? Do we register typically a covenant around hours on title?
Thank you for the question. Yes, this is a tool that can be used to enforce conditions, and it has been used for other applications before.
Thank you. Director McMahon?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak generally in favor of this application. I was at Persephone a few days ago. It's really valuable right now, as we're having yet another wave of COVID, to have a place that you can meet up with people in an outdoor setting or in a very, very ventilated setting. I had to have a meeting with somebody whose partner had tested positive, and we weren't going to meet indoors anyway. So we sat over top of the septic field at a great distance from each other, and had a very good conversation. And I think we felt reasonably safe. So I appreciate having these venues, especially these days. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Seegers?
Sorry, I'm going to revisit the conversation again. In this case, this premises, they actually own the building. I know in the district of Sechelt, we had 3 of these, I think, come before us recently, and they don't own the space they're in. Like, they lease it. So this is not even an option to register on title because they don't own the property. So it just seems a bit weird that we would do this. So just a little further explanation on that.
Manager Jackson.
Thank you. Through the chair, I can try and take a stab at that one. There's a few different ways you can look at trying to control them. One of them would certainly be a condition of use in zoning that would permit a use. That would be one way. This one being an agricultural property, it is more of a case-by-case basis, is why we've gone the DVP route in this particular one, so that we can ensure control on these when they come up. And, you know, the different agricultural properties that we have here on the coast have differing neighbors, and so uses may be more appropriate at certain locations than others. Registering to title, it is something that a landlord could certainly agree to have done as part of having a lease for their property, so that could be still a mechanism used. In a case like that, though, we would obviously, or this case, when it comes time that they're no longer doing it, we are party to that covenant and can agree to discharge it. So they're relatively simple mechanisms in terms of how that works for the putting them on title, discharging them, and they're not something that sort of has to be a forever piece. So that's one of the advantages to going the covenant route as well.
Thank you. Director Hiltz.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm going to ask, I'm interested, there's a couple people in the audience. There was mention of 17 properties, so I'm not sure how to ask the people in the audience a question. So I'm going to ask it through the chair. Were you a property who received the letter? I was just, so you're in the area then, okay. And you reviewed the letter and made sense to you, and you're satisfied with the process? Yeah. Oh, okay, thanks for coming out, all the way from West Howe Sound, so yeah.
Thank you, Director Hiltz. I don't see any other hands up. Oh, Director Hiltz, I see your hand up. Are you going to move something for me?
I will move for you, yes. So what page are we on?
353.
353, yes, Chair. I will move the recommendations as presented by staff on page 353. Thanks.
And I have multiple seconders for that, so thank you for that, Director Hiltz. That's on the floor. I don't see any other hands up, so I will call the question. Electoral Area Directors, all those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you very much. And thank you for being here today. And with that, we are going to move back in our agenda to Annex A, Sunshine Coast Regional District Zoning Amendment Bylaw number 722, except this isn't a zoning amendment bylaw. So zoning bylaw 722, consideration of second reading. I'll turn this over to Mr. Sayao.
Thank you, Chair. So I will do an introduction of the second reading of the bylaw. So I'm sharing my screen here. So following the first reading, zoning bylaw 722 was referred to agencies and advisory planning commissions for comments. 2 public information meetings were held. A web page dedicated to the bylaw is also online to provide information to the public and to receive feedback and answer questions. What we heard through this consultation process can be summarized in 8 common points. And here's how we can address them. So we heard that bold and quick actions are needed to address the current housing crisis. The housing crisis is a very large issue and we need many solutions. Zoning bylaw is only one of them. Bylaw 722 is the first step and provides some small solutions to remove design barriers and to enhance options, focusing on infill housing opportunities such as secondary suites and larger auxiliary dwellings in existing properties. Groundworks to lay the foundation for further future comprehensive zoning bylaw and other planning policies, such as regional growth baseline research, are currently underway and will be considered. We heard the request to allow smaller lots using efficient sewage treatment systems to be created by subdivision. Based on feedback from Vancouver Coastal Health, larger parcel size is still the standard for subdivision using the conventional type 1 system, which is more reliable. VCH will consider smaller lot subdivision using more efficient type 2 or type 3 systems only if the municipality has enacted a maintenance bylaw and enforce the bylaw for these systems. Upgrade to existing systems for infill development can be approved through the building permit process. We heard that increasing auxiliary dwelling size will encourage more short-term rental. Well, it's not to worry. Bylaw 722 explicitly prohibits short-term rentals in auxiliary dwellings over 55 square meters. For those under 55 square meters, short-term rental will continue to be allowed, just the same as the existing bylaw 310. We heard opposing opinions about keeping chickens and bees. Some want more of them and others want less. We came up with a balanced solution. Chickens and bees will be allowed on parcels will not be allowed under 1,000 square meters. For parcels between 1,000 and 3,500 square meters, 6 hens will be allowed for every 1,000 square meters, but no roosters will be allowed. For parcels over 3,500 square meters, all kinds of domestic livestock is allowed, just the way it is in the current bylaw 310. And also, we have added requirements for facility setbacks and registration with the province in the updated zoning bylaw 722. We heard that 20% of the total building floor area for home-based business is too small. The percentage is now revised to 50% for residential zones and 40% for all other zones. We heard the need for a more fair and proportionate building floor area ratio to accommodate small parcels under 1,500 square meters. Now the building floor area ratio for lots under 1,500 square meters is revised to 40% of the lot area, or 450 square meters, whichever is the less. We heard the need for the bylaw to support climate action plan. The bylaw has provisions to support better insulated buildings, to reduce energy consumption, to support renewable energy device, and to support flood prevention and protection of the marine ecosystem through consistent waterfront setbacks. And we also heard the request to reduce the parcel size for cannabis micro cultivation from 4 hectares to 2 hectares. The 4 hectares is a more conservative number, and in order to come up with more detailed and fair parcel size number, it would be better to be considered. This would be better considered in the future bylaw updates. For now, the parcel size reduction can be reviewed in a case-by-case basis through a variance application. And throughout the consultation process, we have received valuable feedback from the APCs, and they have indicated that they will need more time to give the bylaw a more detailed review. So a workshop with the APCs is being planned for the summer. So with that, staff recommend the bylaw 722 proceed to second reading and a public hearing to be arranged. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Seau. Just before I go to my directors here, Director Ties did mention that we do have a resident that may wish to speak to this. If you do want to speak to this, we can accommodate you over at the staff table. We do have microphones over there. Our delegation mic is out of service right now, so if you want to come speak. If you would like to speak now. Otherwise, we can go to the directors and we can come back to you later on.
Okay, I'd rather.
Sure, okay. All right, Director McMahon?
Yeah, my first question is, what is the timeline we're looking at for the public hearing? Because, of course, we can't take any further submissions after the public hearing closes, and there is a lot of interest out there. Thank you.
Who wants, Manager Jackson?
Thanks, I can take that question. Through the chair, yes, thank you for the question. We're targeting to have the public hearing in September. So through the summer, we will be working hard and fast to make sure that we've addressed any sort of last minute comments that we might hear today and have direction to actually look at those comments and possibly adjust anything that's needed adjusting. So that is the target. There's been, this bylaw has been going for quite some time, and so there's been quite a number of opportunities for consultation. We're, working hard at trying to take everything that we hear very seriously and trying to implement it where we can, but noting that there is some parameters around this bylaw, so we're ultimately trying to make sure that it sort of fits what the actual scope of the bylaw work was and what might have to wait for later work. Thank you.
Follow up, are you okay? No. Okay, Director Lee?
Thank you, Chair. There's on page 2, it talks about type 1, type 2, and type 3 systems, which would be on private property. I'm just looking for, it actually intrigues me. And so I was looking for if there's an opportunity for a little more information. It would suggest from this that there is no type 2 or 3 systems on private property that's been authorized by Vancouver Coastal Health. I was curious if I got that right. And the second part of my question is, it would seem like Vancouver Coastal Health is requesting that we insist that private property owners do testing and report back to us, so we would be making sure that they were meeting requirements. So have I got that right? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good one and a bit of a complex one anytime we get these sort of multi-agencies involved with approval processes. So there are in fact type 2 and type 3 systems that have been approved by VCH within the regional district. Those are approved on lots where either they cannot get perk, so the soil's quality is not there to basically allow a type 1 system, and or on smaller lots that already pre-existed the regulations that they have in place, which have been in place for quite some time, I believe about 30 years, in terms of the 2,000 square meter requirement for subdivision. So what they're saying is that they won't approve further subdivisions at less than 2,000 square meters because they would then require a type 2 and type 3 system. And for them to approve those subdivisions and basically create more type 2 and 3s than we already would need, we would be required to then have a maintenance bylaw where we were going out and essentially ensuring that people were keeping those systems up to date because they are more maintenance heavy, and essentially failure and part of VCH's work is to monitor sort of water quality health within the region, and they do testing. I know in some areas on smaller lots they actually have found dangerous levels of effluent in the groundwater and ditches surrounding those areas. So that's sort of the reason for their concern around that, is they know that those smaller lots, whether they have an older pre-existing type 1 system or an unmaintained type 2 or type 3 system, they can create problems. So they essentially aren't letting go of creating more of those types of lots that would then require that extra maintenance unless the SCRD was to have that maintenance bylaw. We've had some pretty good conversations with VCH through this process. And essentially their recommendations are actually more for us to look at neighborhood centers where we would have actual sewage treatment plants that would accommodate growth that we need. So they've had some different recommendations out there that would be more of a long-range planning exercise to look at the feasibility of those. But at this time, the 2,000 square meters is what they've stuck with for subdivision size.
Thank you. That actually makes sense to me. Great.
Thank you. Director McMahon.
Right, I have some residential agriculture questions. First, I don't envy staff trying to find a happy medium on the subject of chickens, because I've been hearing both sides of that question at considerable volume, and yes. So first, what happened to the bunnies? We used to have bunnies in the bylaw. And then if something is not mentioned in the bylaw, if the bylaw, for instance, is silent on emus, does that mean that emus are allowed, or does it mean that unless they're specifically allowed, then they're prohibited?
Manager Jackson.
I can perhaps try and take part of that question, specifically the emu question, and I might pass it over to Senior Planner Xiao for some of the research bases on the chickens and other bunnies and things like this. In terms of the bylaw, if something is not expressly permitted, then it would be prohibited. So by not calling out livestock, for example, which is what an emu would likely fall under, although it's more of a bird, but it still would fall under livestock, I guess, being the size that it is. It would not be expressly permitted in these residential zones. So these are the sorts of things that fall into the definition sections of the bylaw. So it's sort of that cross-referencing piece that we often hear us refer to in terms of if we change one thing in one location, we've got to go back and look at the interpretations and the definitions and what's actually included in those things to see whether it was actually expressly permitted. In terms of the research that we've done regarding, I know there's been quite a bit of research that staff have done to try and land this mark, find that balance, as you sort of said, in terms of what can be permitted. There's some changes here that, as you mentioned, what happened to the bunnies, but there's also some other changes actually going to slightly smaller lot sizes to allow residential agriculture. So this was all taken in context and consultation with the Ministry of Agriculture. And I'll turn it over to Senior Planner Xiao to just add to that and how we landed on the regulation that we currently have proposed.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So actually, the bunnies is one of the livestock that was permitted in the old bylaw 310 for parcels that is under 1,500 square meters. But the new bylaw has a new provision for chickens and bees because these two types of animals are the most common, and we heard from the consultation process, this is what most people want to keep. And we didn't hear much about bunnies or other animals. So therefore we have come up with a new parcel size category, which is between 1,000 to 3,500 square meters to allow these two particular types of animal. But still, all other kinds of livestock, including bunnies, ducks, turkeys, whatever, emus. So will continue to be allowed, but on a parcel that is bigger, larger than 3,500 square meters. So those will continue to be allowed. So that's perhaps that's where the bunny has gone to, and into that category. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to jump in real quick, sort of tagging on to the backyard agriculture. As you know, we're going through the zoning bylaw renewal process in Seashalt, and one of the things that came back from Ministry of Agriculture was that with backyard hens and I think the beehives as well, they wanted owners to register for a premises ID, which I guess is to help with emergency response, just so they know sort of where the agriculture is. Was there any consideration to that requirement given for 722?
Yes, there are actually two provisions has been included in the revision to bylaw 722. So a requirement to register with the province for beehives and also all kinds of livestock.
Thank you. I read the first revision of the zoning bylaw in depth, but I didn't get a chance to read this one in depth, so thank you for that. Director Hiltz.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think my question is kind of around the definitions and some other aspects that aren't affecting density. So my question for staff is, Manager Jackson talked about last minute comments. So at what stage are we at last minute comments? I'm thinking specifically around certain definitions. Poultry being one of the definitions, or micro livestock. So after the public hearing, can these definitions continue to be changed as at this point in, so what can be changed, I guess, in terms of definitions? And one of the things that came out in the discussions, particularly around the APCs, is the usability of the document itself. 300-page document, District of Seashelt is going through it. So how people are talking about the navigability, the user-friendliness of the document. So what is right now, the way it's structured, it doesn't look like it's quite complete in terms of the bookmarking and internal hyperlinks and things like this. So that's part of the intent of it, is to make it more usable, and more usable for the general public opposed to professional planners, I guess I'd also. So where is the scope, where is this line between, if we want to call micro livestock includes bunnies and rabbits and, floppy ears or whatever, at what point does that definition have to get nailed down? And kind of the navigation, more the kind of housekeeping aspects of the document itself. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Manager Jackson or Mr. Seau? Manager Jackson, go ahead.
I'll try and take some of this from the top, and I may lean on Senior Planner Seau for a couple of points. We'll see where we get to. In terms of the timing and changes, the big thing with any sort of bylaw, so this is the same for a new zoning bylaw or any zoning amendment, is following a public hearing, we cannot make changes to use or density. That would trigger a new public hearing. So we can make administrative tweaks, word choice, style issues, spelling mistakes, just providing further clarity on an interpretation, these sorts of things, as long as it doesn't impact use or density. Theoretically, a setback or height regulation could be changed as long as it wasn't deemed to impact use or density. At this particular time, we have not had a public hearing, so theoretically changes can be made to maintain a September public hearing. Certainly we're getting tight on time, so if there were at this time some sort of a resolution for a specific change that might affect use or density, we could look at that prior to the public hearing if it was a specific resolution that we could clearly bring forward for the public hearing. And then I would add to that, following this, is that one of the challenges here is that we do have a 30-year-old zoning bylaw, and we are at a point of misalignment of legislation with the ALC, with federal regulations around cannabis, and even other local government updates in terms of some of the numbering in the sections of the Local Government Act. So there's a number of things in here that are actually quite out of date and are starting to be tripping hazards for staff and the public as we try and use the existing bylaw 310. So one of the things moving forward is certainly considering these as living documents. We know that we have a lot of future planning work to do that may drastically change both this bylaw and our other zoning bylaws, Bylaw 337 for Area A. What that looks like yet, we don't know. But in the interim, it's certainly something that with working with the board, we can look at bringing forward housekeeping amendments to make changes as we see fit as time goes on. So it's not the holy grail of permanent and it's sort of printed and there's 1,000 copies and it can't be changed. There is this process right here where we can come to and look at housekeeping amendments as we go on and sort of test things out and see a need for possible changes that we didn't foresee at this time. And again, as things change and legislation changes, really just trying to keep things up to date. So it's something that's done regularly with a lot of local governments, is those sort of housekeeping amendments, if you will, that come from time to time to make sure it stays current and that it's fitting the needs of the community. In terms of the usability, there's been a lot of work done with this bylaw in terms of cleaning up language consistency. There's a lot of new definitions, if you look, that have been provided. And so that is actually providing that clarity to really say what we mean and be clear about it and make it easy for people to figure that out. We've gone with things like adding italicized words to refer to a definition when it's actually defined. So it's very clear when you see that or italicized word, oh, okay, what does that mean? We can go look that up. Mentioned the implementation of charts. Just, you know, the consistency with the other regulations too is about a usability and just clarity, and it sort of takes that murkiness out of process. Am I allowed to do this? Am I not? I have one piece of legislation saying this, but then a zoning bylaw saying another thing. And then with that too, there's been some other changes, like the definitions are at the back. The zoning bylaw schedules are now attached to the bylaw. And I might turn it over to Senior Planner Xiao, who's been our technical expert on this and may know some other changes that I'm missing for user friendliness.
Thanks, Johnson. I don't have anything further to add.
Okay, well, I am co-chairing with Director Toth right now, so I'm going to allow myself a follow-up question then. So the terminology, single unit dwelling versus a single detached dwelling. The district C shelter is going through this right now, and they're using single detached dwelling. It's and it's kind of when the term was, we were talking about it at the APC, a single unit dwelling, people really struggled to understand what that meant. There's no visual aspect of the form and character of what that means, and opposed to a single detached dwelling, which I'm going, it's not got anything attached to it, and people could clearly see it. So, the district of Seashelt is moving in the single detached direction. The town of Gibsons is still kind of in the single family, and we're in this transition, and so the planning profession seems to be split on this. And in terms of our neighborhoods, we talk about detached neighborhoods. So it's, and CMHC uses that. Our own housing needs assessment calls them single detached dwellings. Stats Canada uses single detached dwellings. Realtor uses single detached dwelling. We don't say, do you want to buy a single unit dwelling? They say, do you want to buy a single detached home? So that was kind of one of these topics that people are going, for consistency across our jurisdictions, would that be a term that would be, would the public be able to weigh in that during the public hearing and say, we understand single detached opposed to single dwelling? Because it seems to be quite a significant situation for the public to understand. Because I think a planner, they totally understand single unit dwelling. I still going, well, I think I get it, but if you tell me it's a single detached dwelling, I know what that is. So I guess that's one of these housekeeping things is, I think it's more of a public, it's my opinion at this point that single detached makes more sense than the other one. So I'm going, at what point could the public weigh into that discussion? So does that have to happen now, or is that something that can unfold as we go along?
Good question. Thank you for raising that. Certainly regional consistency and sort of user friendliness is definitely something that we're striving for here. I'm not 100% sure of the history. It was before my time coming back when the single unit terminology had been decided. I know it came from a point where single family, there's been some court cases about what involves a family and not something that we want to be sort of muddying in. So that was the reason for the change from single family dwelling. Something that's become common in the profession. Lots of local governments are going that direction of finding something new. I guess what we're seeing is the flavor of something new has sort of got a bit of variety to it. The good news about this particular question is that it is a defined term. So theoretically, something like changing the name but not changing what it means and not changing the use or density associated with that term is really something that we could address at the public hearing stage if we were hearing significant concerns about it. Certainly, if there was enough concern now, it's something we could also address, but it's essentially the name of a term, so it doesn't actually impact the use or density because it's a defined term. So we would just, it would essentially be a name change, but still achieving exactly the same thing. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
And Senior Planner Xiao has a little bit more to follow up on that.
Planner Xiao?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. So I just have a comment to make. So the term single unit was used because it was defined as opposed to multiple units. So that's the purpose to set it apart from multi-unit dwellings, and also not all this type of called single detached dwelling are actually detached because they could be attached to, say, an auxiliary dwelling. So they're making them not really a standalone detached dwelling. So, so that's why the term unit is used, just to emphasize. So the dwelling only can contain one living unit. In most cases, that's one set of cooking facilities and for one family. Thanks.
Thank you. Director Ties.
Thank you. Going back to the poultry and rabbits, I do think that changing chickens to poultry, rabbits, and bees, like the clause on page 3, or the table on page 3 is something that I'd be okay with. Rabbits only become a problem if they escape, and they're pretty good at procreating. But we also have plenty of predators in the area, so not too worried about that. And I think the parcel size doesn't really make a difference as to where the rabbits escape from. So that's just a comment. But the big thing that I'd like to address is that I'd like to add to the recommendation that the APCs and the OCPC, the Roberts Creek OCPC, be referred this report for further comment. They spoke when they were first consulted that they didn't have enough information. At least my APC said that, and not enough of a good comparison. I think this report is great, and this is the one that I think the APC and the OCPC should have a chance to weigh in on. And provide feedback before the public hearing. Now, I don't know how that works with the timelines, and whether they can meet in August, but I would certainly be in favor of that. I don't know if staff and directors have any comments on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Ties. I'm just going to look to staff for a moment about the timing. Do the APCs usually get an opportunity to meet in August, or would this be pushing it back at this point to September for them?
Thank you for the question. We are looking at holding a special APC meeting, so certainly we could expand that scope and invite others. But basically, we're looking at holding one meeting where we can go and give a presentation to those groups all together. So that we can kind of take sort of a united approach in terms of how we provide them information, and everybody will get exactly the same presentation at the same time. So that was the plan, to hold a special APC meeting. I know there's been some conversations already circulating about it, but it's something that planning will reach out to them and try and find a time to arrange that works for all.
Thank you. Director Ties.
Yeah, follow up. So is that one big general meeting the equivalent of getting this report referred, or would that be a separate thing? Because the general meeting with a presentation, is that more of a here's the information and now there's a larger discussion on it, including this report, or is that sort of or is it more of just a here's your information and you don't really get to give a whole lot of feedback on this? So just if you can clarify that, thanks.
Good question, absolutely. So in terms of a possible recommendation here, it sounds like having the report referred in advance of that meeting, not a problem. We can certainly do that. The type of feedback, though, that we get, it's sort of geared, the idea is that it'll be more geared towards an orientation with the bylaw, trying to really go through sort of the changes and make sure that everyone's clear on what's happening, identify any issues that there might be, though, at that time. What will happen, though, is that obviously, given where we're at here with second reading and the trajectory that we're trying to hit with a September public hearing. Changes to use or density might be challenging at that time. Certainly if there's thoughts and recommendations from APCs that the board wishes to see carried forward that do not affect use or density, at that time when we go to the public hearing, they could certainly be incorporated. But the use and density sort of pieces at this time, that's, as we move forward and prepare any recommendations coming out of today, once we've sort of got that bylaw ready to be aired for public hearing, what's seen at that public hearing, that's the bylaw that will be sort of ingrained in terms of its use and density. But as I mentioned, you know, other tweaks can be made at that time if they don't affect use or density. Happy to provide a bit more clarity if needed. I know it's a bit complicated and it's sort of a timing crunch as well in there, but so staff are trying to do our best to navigate that and ensure that we collect as much feedback as possible and, you know, have this bylaw sort of hit the ground running. We know that we hear a lot of need for it out there in the community, and there's a lot of anticipation around it. So that's where we are hoping to look to move it forward to that September public hearing. And then, of course, after that, if there is some sort of an issue that comes up, as I mentioned, housekeeping bylaws, they're done all the time in other local governments and can certainly be looked at to address concerns as they arise, if they arise. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I was going to make that comment, was that passing this isn't, you know, pass it and then never look at it again for the next 20 years. If something comes along that got missed or the community just really wants changed, it can always be amended. Director Ties, was that sufficient for now or for your question?
Yes and no. I would like, in some way or another, for our advisory committees to be able to give feedback on this report in a substantive way. And as I'm hearing this, I'm not quite getting that. I'm not quite getting that intent. So. I'm not sure what the other directors have to say about that, but.
So, Ian, GM Hall.
Thank you, Chair. If it helps with promoting clarity, I'll note on page 6 of the agenda where staff talk about next steps. Our intention is to support our APCs further, and I would also like to acknowledge the quality of feedback that has been provided by APCs so far. Someone mentioned earlier the length of the bylaw. It's a lot to digest. So staff do want to support them. We have a plan to do that. And we'd already thought about the need to have clarity about where feedback received goes. And as Manager Jackson said, there are a number of avenues, a number of buckets that it can go into so that it can all be used. And hearing the comments from directors who we know rely on APCs, staff can double down on ensuring that there's that clarity for our valued volunteers. Thanks.
Thank you. Director Lee.
Thank you, Chair. On page 5, it talks about increased ocean setback of 15 meters. I was wondering if we could get some clarity on that setback issue. And what comes to my mind is I believe we have DPAs in some areas that are like 15 meters already. I believe it's because there's best practices for sea rise and storm surge, erosion, vegetation removal. So I was just looking for a little clarity about if this is provincial requirements, best practices, what's prompted this?
Manager Jackson.
I can try and take first crack at that, and Senior Planner of Seattle may have some follow-ups as well. So this has come from quite a bit of consultation, looking at best practices with other local governments, including here on the coast, and sort of seeing what is a consistent setback from the ocean. Recently had the pleasure of sitting in on some conferences with my institute, the Planning Institute of BC, and chat about, you know, sea level rise and appropriate setbacks. And it does seem that 15 meters is that sort of number that a lot of other jurisdictions are at. In fact, Area D, Roberts Creek, already had the 15-meter setback in here. We also do have some DPAs as well that look at further vegetative requirements and sort of protection of those areas when we know that they were already sensitive. So it's really about implementing a best practice, a consistent practice, and looking at also protecting that, essentially that public good around the oceanfront setback. Having seen a lot of developments where they really do push those boundaries right up to the edge, and you end up with sort of almost castle walls against the oceanfront, if you will. So it's looking at implementing best practices in terms of sea level rise, erosion, protection of habitat, as well. There's also archaeological considerations as well that are quite common along the oceanfront. So protecting really some of the Sunshine Coast's most sensitive land with an appropriate setback is the intent here.
So if there was a property that basically there's a mountain right against the ocean and it would make sense to not have to go the 15 meters, well, I think I just answered my own question, because it's distance, it's not actual setback. So could they meet the 15 meters without actually being 15 meters from a straight up line back? And if they couldn't, would there be some sort of variance that would allow them to do that?
Very good question. Zoning bylaws are rarely sort of one-size-fits-all solutions. That they have to be by nature, unless you go comprehensive development zones in every sort of major development that you have. So what we often see is sort of a general regulation like this that goes in to protect certain assets. In this case, the oceanfront setback. That being said, there is the variance process that can be taken when there is a consideration that they've sort of checked all their boxes. There's no sensitive habitat. There's no risk of erosion, i.e. they're sitting sort of on a castle of rock already, possibly in Area A. I know that those exist, but certainly they're elsewhere on the coast as well. And, through their, proper professionals ensuring that they've done, proper archaeological assessments, sea level rise, make sure that the elevation's right, we could look at variances. And in fact, as part of coming up with this setback, we actually did an exercise where we did a high level geographic mapping of the coastline and looked at the properties that we figured would have challenges meeting the 15-meter setback. And we came up with about 30 properties that we figured would all, essentially, if redevelopment was to happen, we'd likely see a variance application for those, and there'd be good cause for it. And we certainly know that with that, there'd be other ones where they'd be more of requests. But if they've gone through the proper processes and proved that it is the right thing to do, then it's certainly something they could get staff support on to have a development variance permit come forward to the board for consideration.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Director McMahon?
Yeah, I'm trying to get some clarity on the question of use or density. So is this our final kick at changing use before the public hearing? And if we said poultry instead of chickens, is that a change of use?
That's a very good question. I would lean on the side of caution when it comes to interpreting a bylaw and suggest that if poultry would expand the use in terms of what would be permitted, then it would probably be a safe bet that legal counsel would also advise that this would be a change of use. So I think it's something that if there's a strong desire to consider poultry, for example, so turkeys, ducks, chickens, bearing in mind that there is issues around roosters, so there may be need for some conversation around exactly what is permitted. This would be the most ideal time to take on that change. Following the public hearing, it would certainly be challenging because we probably put ourselves in a position where we may be advised by legal counsel to have to hold a second public hearing to accommodate that change or deal with it at a later date through a housekeeping amendment. Thank you.
Director McMahon? Okay. Director Pratt?
Thank you, Chair Toth. I would support the change of the term chicken to poultry as well. I know I know with larger parcels, you could have the fowl or the poultry in there, but I think there's a number of people that actually they may have chickens, but they might also have one duck, and or a goose or a duck goose, if you will, and you mix just because they get along well with chickens. So I would personally, I would support the change from chicken to poultry. I'm also around the home-based business piece. Um, I if we make any changes, have those changes already been made that within the existing bylaw, or the existing consideration, the existing draft that we have in there right now, or should we look at that further as well? Home-based business is a huge thing in the rural areas, and I have some concerns to make sure that we're still protecting that for our community too, especially in recognition that some of these home-based businesses do need a larger space, especially if you're something like a woodworker or maybe doing auto mechanics or something like that. So, and then also around the APC piece, I think it's, I know we don't usually see letters from APCs when we do public hearings and such, but can it be made clear to them that if they did want to present additional information, like written information, or have their chair speak to something at the public hearing, that could also be an option for them as well?
Thank you, Director Pratt. Manager Jackson?
Thank you. I think there was a couple of questions in there. I might actually work backwards and just address the APC one, that yes, certainly that would be an avenue, is to provide that direction to APCs, that if they wish to put some specifics into a letter to ensure that it's clearly articulated and heard and documented, that would be a good way to ensure that feedback comes forward. And then ultimately at that time, staff can also work to advise them as well as to exactly what type of feedback can be possibly changed at that time and what might actually trigger a public hearing and may be more appropriate to wait for later, or unless it was decided that there was an issue that was of concern, that there was a delay warranted or what have you. So that would certainly be a good avenue to ensure that that's documented and we can give that direction to APCs if that's what is desired. In terms of just kind of going back to the home-based business, I think there was some questions around there. So staff, did hear loud and clear at a lot of the public information meetings that we held most recently in June. Quite a few great comments around home-based business, and there were some changes that were incorporated into this bylaw based on that feedback. Quite significant changes, actually. I think going from a 20% floor area ratio to 50% for R1, R2, and 3 zones, and then 40% in all other zones. So it's quite high. We did a lot of research on this as well, looked at other municipalities and local governments, and 50% sort of seems to be that kind of threshold as to when you've gone from, if you're using more than half of your floor area as a commercial use, in most cases, you're probably starting to tip the scale as to actually needing commercial zoning. So in these cases, though, certainly there is planning application processes, whether it's through a zoning amendment or development variance permit, depending on what the nature of their required accommodation is, we could call it. They could certainly be considered on a case-by-case basis. So the bylaw is not looking to limit people's abilities to actually run businesses if they're a good idea and they fit the needs of a residential zone, but just rather put some parameters on it to ensure that as we grow and the conflicts in neighborhoods start to sort of, possibly rise if we have not the right regulations around what people can and cannot do, and it becomes sort of a bylaw enforcement issue. And certainly some of this has come from learning lessons of what we've heard in terms of a variety of concerns throughout the use of Bylaw 310 and also the public consultations that we've done. So this has all sort of landed us on these numbers, but knowing so that there are avenues for folks to pursue if they feel that they've got a business that, maybe doesn't quite fit the bylaw, but does fit a residential zone. And then that's that time too, when whether through conditions of use in a possibly site-specific zoning amendment, or through covenant of a development variance permit, or just conditions of the development variance permit, that we can look at having specific parameters if they were, say, looking to do something that's outside of the bylaw, but we wanted to make sure that maybe there was, for example, some time regulations, like no auto mechanics at 10 p.m. or something like that. You know, we could look at doing that at that time, or regulating the number of staff, customers, things like this. So those are all options that we can look at through here. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Director Ties.
Yeah, I'm kind of speaking to the same issue, and that's on point 5 on page 4 of the report, with the 20% of total floor area of all buildings to be used for home-based business. So I see that there's an intention to amend that slightly, but I think that the measure used is the one that the issue I really have with it, because what it does, it gives perverse incentives for people to build larger homes. So essentially what you're saying is that if you want a shop of a certain size, you need to build a really massive house in order to accommodate it. And I don't think that's what we want to encourage. So I'm wondering if we can use some different measure. If you've got 5 acres and you have a 1,500 square foot home, which is ample for a couple, I still think that having a 3,000 square foot workshop is okay, because you might be an artist, you might be somebody that makes large sculptures. So I think going away from the total floor area of all buildings as a measure is something that we need to consider here, and maybe go with something more that's linked to property size. Those are some thoughts. You know, I know some people that, they have, I think, a 1,700 square foot home and a 3,000 square foot shop on a 5 acre property, and it's not a problem. And so, yeah, I do think we need to sort of look at that critically and kind of come up with a different way of measuring that, in my opinion. I don't know if staff has any comments on that.
Just as I go to staff, I'm going to ask another question that's related to this, is that when we talk about, you know, changing use or density, are we talking about population density? Are we talking about structure density? Is this something that we would have to have resolved before public hearing? Or could it be resolved after public hearing, or modified after public hearing?
Good questions. This is really more of a condition of use in this particular case. So going back on my planning law, I believe we could possibly make changes following a public hearing on this particular item. But when we talk about use and density, we are talking generally about structure density, the density of a lot. So in other words, how many lots you can carve out of a parcel into a subdivision. Those sorts of things. Uses include the type of uses that you're permitting, whether they be a single family, a 2-family use, commercial use, these sorts of things. So there's an opportunity here that we could possibly look at that. I'm also hearing some comments, and if there's, again, you know, it's one of those things that if we feel there's something that there's a desire to tweak now, certainly going out with our best foot forward is always the best measure in terms of doing so. The 50% is something that is a pretty commonplace regulation that we found looking elsewhere. Obviously recognizing that there's a good comment there around, you know, not wanting to encourage larger homes. Certainly there's, you know, no need for that. There could be other metrics that could be possibly devised. We have other regulations in the bylaw, for example, where there's a maximum floor area or 50%, and it's sort of whatever's greater, you kind of hit a trigger, like, you know, and it could work to the point that you can go up to this, unless it's, you have more floor area, then you can go, you know, up to 50%, or it could be a size maximum and or 50%. Like, we could play with numbers to sort of find a bit of a balance there to make sure that it's fair. This did come directly out of the public consultation that we were hearing and trying to go back and rethink how to sort of do better and make sure that we're meeting the needs of folks out there with businesses. But if we're not quite there yet, we're happy to take that feedback and direction as required. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Ties, did you have a follow-up to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I don't want to be, I'm not the expert as to how to do this best, and I think usually staff comes up with good ideas, but I do think that we should go away from the current, I guess, methodology. So I'm wondering if there's, I can make a motion for staff to take it back and come up with something that doesn't create incentive to make larger homes. I don't.
I'm going to get you to put a pin in that just for a moment.
Okay.
Because Director Seegers did wave me that she wants to speak to this as well. So I'll go to Director Seegers first.
Thank you. I think what we want to look at here is the bigger picture, right? Not just, I mean, what staff are looking at doing in the zoning bylaw is looking down the road. Yes, there's going to be changes and things happening down the road, but we also know that the Sunshine Coast is getting more development. There's going to be more subdivisions. There's going to be smaller lots. And with the zoning bylaw allowing for big business, which is what it is, big business on a residential property, that has an impact on the community and the neighborhood. So I know what you're trying to say. You're trying to say we want to allow these to happen, but there's also a piece in there about ensuring that the community fit is there, and that as it densifies, we aren't unintentionally creating areas where there is more conflict between the residences and the businesses that are happening. And so it's how do we create the structure that allows them to go on, but also ensures that the community, somebody moving in, for example, knows, yes, there's a commercial endeavor happening over here, and that could impact my house. Or now we've got these smaller lots, and that might impact, have an impact with the business, et cetera there. So it's how do we balance those off and ensure that as we go forward, we've made sure we've kept the community feel that we wanted to have. So I think what I'm hearing staff say is that we're not saying, no, you can't have something bigger than 50%. But when it gets beyond 50%, there needs to be another process inside of that so that the community's engaged and gets involved in what that's going to look like going forward. So how do we balance those two off? I don't know, but I think it's how do we balance off the different needs that we're looking at creating inside of the zoning bylaw. And I think another thing I'm hearing is that once this zoning bylaw gets passed, we're going to be looking at OCP. Right? We're going to be looking at updating the OCPs so that we look at where are we going to allow that density, where are we not going to allow that density, and look at the community, which will also then play back into this. And maybe some of these properties would have a different zoning so that there's community engagement and community involvement around that growth. So I don't know how we play with that, and I don't know if this is the right time to go in and make that change, because we haven't had those bigger conversations. That's all I have to say.
If somebody wanted to build a workshop bigger than 50%, would they be able to apply for a development variance permit?
Thank you for the question. It was the one thing I was regretting I didn't say last time, is that is the thing with this as being a condition of use, just as the same approach that we've taken with some of the requests around the micro cannabis, is that there is that option that if somebody wants to do something that is, they want to have the small house and they want to have the bigger workshop, for example, a development variance permit would be an option. If there's something that's out of scope of home-based business, we could look at site-specific amendments that put different parameters around that, sort of beyond home-based business, but not quite commercial sort of idea. Further to that, I would add that there's options out there that are coming out through the province's development approvals initiatives. One of those is looking at even the ability to do staff-approved development variances. They've granted that ability to date. Based on my last conversations with folks at the province, no local government's actually implemented it yet, but many are working hard at trying to figure out how and where to implement it. So this could be one of those things where there could be board policies around, if sort of so many boxes are ticked, a consideration could be given as, for example, a manager-approved development variance permit to sort of speed up the process of doing so. There'd be another level where maybe community engagement, so we could have other avenues that folks could explore to do this. I'd also add that when it comes to workshops, there's also size limits on the actual workshops based on different zones and different lot areas. So in those cases, there's often a cap anyways, and if you probably look at most housing, in many cases, it's very rare that the shop is bigger than the house. There's some out there, and I'm sure that there's some non-conforming shops that might be the case, and there may be some new builds where somebody did really decide to build that sort of tiny house that maybe was a 1 or 2 small bedroom house, and they maxed out their shop size. But those cases are probably pretty rare, where that's actually the case. And when that does come up, there are many planning application mechanisms that we can explore to accommodate folks looking to do those sorts of things that are a slightly different flavor than what's sort of presented here in the bylaw. Thank you.
Thank you. Director McMahon.
Yes, well, my eyes are now really crossing. This gets wonderfully complicated. Just a suggestion to throw out that when you are presenting this to the public, it would be a good idea to explain grandfathering, because it's important that people be clear that there are existing, non-compliant uses, non-conforming uses, and that's like Area E in a nutshell. I'm a little concerned on page 15 that we're getting very, very prescriptive about the types of business, and that I'm not sure that we need to get quite that prescriptive. Item K particularly, which says that we will not allow kennels, vehicle equipment repair and maintenance, body shops, and fabricating. But previously, under item G, it elucidates the reasons, essentially, that we do not want to create these things. Noise, smoke, dust, toxic, odor, heat, etc., which those kind of businesses fall into that category. So I'm wondering the rationale for specifically disallowing those, particularly given that there's not a lot of industrial property around. So I take it the idea would be to move like fabricating away from residential neighborhoods, understandably. But, if the only place they can go is Twin Creeks, then that starts to, create a problem. So I'd just like to hear what staff have to say.
Thank you for that. Manager Jackson.
I can start out, and I might see if Senior Planner Seow has anything further to add on this. These are the sort of heavy uses that we, have seen in our research that typically are prohibited from home-based businesses in most local governments. As we grow, as we see conflicts start to arise with neighbors, we hear our bylaw enforcement lines ringing off the hook. This was one of the considerations that we had to take into these regulations and thinking about how we grow as a community and, what is a residential neighborhood use and what maybe belongs elsewhere. Again, this one here, because we've outright prohibited the actual use, it's not a condition of use, that's an actual use that we're prohibiting. That would not be achievable through a development variance permit process in this case, and it would be rather a site-specific zoning amendment, but there still is a process. And so again, it's not that staff can't entertain these on a case-by-case basis. It's just that there's an application process that someone would have to go through, parameters that they would have to put around. Perhaps if it's a fabricating shop, there might be a limit on floor area. Maybe there's acoustical requirements for how it's built to ensure that there's, not negative impacts on the neighborhood in terms of how they're doing their business. Sort of, not, 3 cars out on construction blocks in the front yard. Definitely the sort of use that we have seen that can go wrong. So these are the sort of uses that, again, we were looking to limit to appropriate zonings, and then that doesn't mean that there can't be a zoning amendment site-specific that would consider them at a specific location. So hope that helps answer that. Thank you.
In the same vein, on page 16, there's limits on the number of non-resident employees. And I understand the intent there, but I should think that that would be remarkably difficult to enforce. You know, how would we go about enforcing that? I think it would, I can see that it would be difficult. That's just my comment.
Yes, sorry, thank you for the question. Mike was off there. It certainly is. One of the challenges, and it does relate to specifically home-based businesses, and also even short-term rentals. Being a regional district, we haven't been granted the powers of having business licenses. There's certainly pros and cons to that. One of those is that through having business licenses, there's always that option of having conditions on the business license that can be sort of an automatic revoking of the business license if someone's not obeying. With SCRD being a regional district, it is on an enforcement basis. It's a little bit more of an honor system. And then when we hear complaints from neighbors, that's when our bylaw enforcement team would be out there looking at that. Certainly it might be a hard thing to enforce, but I know there's been cases where bylaw has been out there and it's quite obvious that there's multiple employees on site and that there's clearly a bylaw contravention, and it's dealt with appropriately in those cases. So, these are sort of the nothing sort of perfect solutions with being a regional district and trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all general set of regulations. But again, something like the number of employees, if somebody had a really great idea and it's not going to have a negative impact on the residential character of the neighborhood, a development variance permit could be considered to increase the number of employees that they have to accommodate their business needs. So it's really what this is trying to do is sort of set a general set of coat hangers for what you can kind of have in terms of the things that you can hang on your home-based business. But when that doesn't work, there's always the option of asking for a coat hook on the backside of the door or something like this to help, accommodate the thing that you need. There are a few things in here that we've expressly prohibited just because we know of the conflicts that can arise. So that would be something that we would treat as essentially as a more robust consultation process, where it would be not a simple DVP, which are relatively quick processes, even when they come to the board for consideration. A zoning amendment that would consider a site-specific use, that's where we sort of get into, a lot deeper community consultation. It's taken seriously so that it really puts the onus on that owner to meet the needs of the neighborhood and ensure that they're fitting the residential character and not breaching that. And in that case, if they go through that process, it's going to be likely quite robust that they would be able to, design their business to meet what they're sort of promising, hopefully, in the proposed amendment. I'd add too that the RU2 zone, if it's over 1.75 hectares, expressly permits some of these uses that are prohibited in general home-based business for the smaller lots. So, and most zones, but there is other opportunities out there within our zoning bylaw that would allow for this besides just the hillside industrial park area. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Got a couple hands up still. I would like to start to wrap this up because this is only Annex A. We've still got some agenda to go. So, Director Ties, I see your hand up.
I have on page 12, 5.3, item C, short-term rental shall not be permitted in a secondary suite. This is big. This is, and I think this is new. I don't think that was something that was previously discussed, and I just thought I'd point that out, and I think it's a considerable change to the bylaw. And that brings me to the next question. What defines a secondary suite? Does it have to have a bedroom, a washroom, and a cooking facility? Do you have to have a physically separated entrance? Or what is a secondary suite? And then going back to Director Hilsa's earlier question, I see this is under the heading of new accessory housing allowance for a single unit dwelling. So is a secondary suite, a house with a secondary suite still a single unit dwelling? So that, there's a few questions there.
Well, thank you for the questions. Some really good questions and comments there. So one of the things that staff have tried to balance, I'll start out sort of at the higher level here, with the secondary suites and the increased auxiliary dwelling unit sizes. I know Senior Planner Xiao specifically called out the prohibition of an STR, short-term rental, in the newer, bigger auxiliary permitted dwelling unit size. So if you have an existing 55 square meter or smaller, or you wanted to build a new one at 55 square meters or smaller, which is what you were permitted in 310, you still could have a short-term rental in there. And we know that that size generally fits the scope of what the bylaw permits for a short-term rental. The new 90 square meter provision would sort of allow something in the neighborhood of a smaller 3-bedroom unit. We're getting in the neighborhood of 968 square feet, 90 square meters. So it is achievable to get 3 bedrooms in those plans. So it starts to get beyond what we know is permitted for a short-term rental. So for that reason, and for the protection and the intent of creating more rental opportunities on the coast, we had done that in terms of ensuring that the newer, bigger size would not be used for a short-term rental. With secondary suites, it specifically allows both a short-term rental elsewhere in the house and a secondary suite. So the intent there was to ensure that we're encouraging rental for long-term, but not sort of using the stick by saying, well, you can no longer do short-term rental if you do that secondary suite. In terms of the user friendliness of the bylaw, this actually kind of goes well as we created some of these new pieces and gone back on some things that weren't previously defined. Things like secondary suite are actually defined in the bylaw, so I can actually quote it here. It means a dwelling unit with a maximum floor area of 55 square meters and 1 set of cooking facilities, auxiliary to and located within a building containing a single unit dwelling. So it specifically allows for it within the single unit dwelling. And that is a little bit of a difference between the detached nature of Sea Shelt, is that with our bylaw, it is possible, well, I know in Sea Shelt as well, and Gibson's secondary suites can be in single detached dwellings, but with our bylaw, in certain cases, you could actually also attach the auxiliary dwelling unit provision. So then it's sort of a quasi semi-detached single unit dwelling, somewhere in that sort of era. So what we've done is we've gone through and we've created these definitions to help provide clarity about exactly what we mean around those provisions, so that the public can quickly identify the italicized term as they're flipping through their zone and go back and see exactly what it means, and probably still come to us with some questions, but at least be sort of at a higher starting point in terms of knowing what is generally said in the bylaw, and sort of more of a simplified, non-technocratic terminology in the definitions. Hope I addressed most of your questions, but happy to take any follow-ups. Thank you.
Director Ties, any follow-up?
I'll think about it.
Okay. Next up, we have Director Seegers.
Thank you. I have 2 pieces. One on page 16. It talks about permitted activities. It says on-site client visits only by appointment, scheduled in advance, and a maximum of 6 clients per day. I mean, I think our guest in the audience pointed out our art crawl that we have each year. And that would not be allowed under this zoning bylaw for these people, because, I mean, I know I don't phone ahead and say, I'm going to come and visit your studio at 10:30 in the morning on my art crawl. So I'm wondering how we could accommodate those kinds of things inside of that. So that's one. Then the other is, we've been talking about DVPs and exemptions and exceptions, all that kind of stuff. Is that actually clearly spelled out in the zoning bylaw? So if somebody comes and says, well, I can't do this because it doesn't fit, and they just walk away? Or do we say, this is our zoning bylaw, and if there's something else that you're looking at doing, we're open to a conversation with you? Is that part of it, or is that assumed, or what? Thanks.
All good questions. I think I might work backwards again on these ones. In terms of the options for things like development variance permits, site-specific zoning amendments, that's where we look to our official community plans to see what type of policies we have in there in terms of, you know, whether or not something actually fits, and that helps to form staff recommendations. The type of application that we actually would use would depend on the Local Government Act and what actually it would allow us to do. So for example, certain things can be varied by means of a development variance permit, conditions of use, setbacks, height regulations, things like this. Things related to use or density cannot be. So those would require a site-specific zoning amendment consideration. And again, we would look for consistency with our official community plan. So that's where when somebody has something different, that it would open that conversation with the planning department as to what their options might be based on that specific request. And in some cases, the answer is that no, it's actually not doable there. And the appropriate thing to be might be to go and actually seek out a parcel with the proper zoning to do the use that they're looking to do. So in terms of the home-based business regulations, it is tough to find a one-size-fits-all. I saw the art crawl comment in there, and it certainly is a good one. It's tough to fit the residential character of a neighborhood, and that's probably a good example of, typically we refer to assembly, and assembly is normally not something that's residential. Technically, the art crawl probably wouldn't have met the current bylaw in terms of actually having an assembly use at a residential zone. And it's just sort of been one of those things that's gone on since the beginning of time, and nobody said anything. And not having business licenses for those sorts of things. In the regional district, it has been a little bit more. If nobody's complaining, nothing's enforced. There is some discretion as far as what bylaws we choose to enforce and not enforce. As a local government, but certainly if there's a call, you know, to have a provision for, you know, annual art crawls, like that's something that we could look to specifically put in there. It's not, you know, when you're putting together a bylaw, it's hard to really accommodate everything, and this is what these consultations are for, is to actually hear those sorts of comments, and that's one that's come up as of late that is a very good and valid comment about a piece of really Sunshine Coast tourist and economic development attraction that is a really important thing in our community, that certainly this bylaw, the intent is not to stop events like that. It just hadn't expressly permitted it. So it's something that if there's a desire for us to look for a special exemption for one annual event, but I would warn that there is a concern with that one size fits all, where the art crawl might fit, but somebody's, you know, annual wedding party might not. So it gets quite to be a difficult balance in terms of that. An art crawl is a little bit different than some of those other assembly uses, but generally speaking, it fits under assembly. There's even liability concerns in terms of what's permitted in terms of having an assembly use in a building that is not rated for it. Fire exiting requirements would probably be the biggest one. There's other things like washrooms and stuff that are also of a concern in terms of building code, but not being a building official, I know that fire safety would be one of those big concerns. So it's a complicated subject. At this sort of time, it's not, you know, going down a path of doing significant research on something would likely look at delaying the bylaw. You know, there could be wording for conditions of use, so that things could be varied on a case-by-case basis for things like art crawls, but again, there might be liabilities attached to that. So without having fully vetted what that means, as mentioned, it would have been an assembly use under the previous bylaw. So it really actually hasn't changed anything as far as what's actually permitted is concerned. I see Senior Planner Sao has his hand up and has done a lot of this research and may have some more to add to that.
All right, let's go to Mr. Sao.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make a comment. So we do appreciate all those comments about home-based business that you have provided to us. And there are certainly, we can look at ways to fine-tune the regulations. But I think we should step back and look at what actually home-based business is. So if we look at the term home-based business, so home comes first, business comes second. So we have to be mindful of that. So as long as zoning continue to be the tool to control land use, so we have residential zones, we have commercial zones. Also, this type of mixed use will will be very difficult to have a balance. Unless the community desire a mixed-use zone that blurs the line between residential and commercial use, then perhaps we need to ask the community if that's what they want. So for home-based business, so there need to be some kind of restriction on the activity in order to distinguish it from a commercial use. If we allow, say, walk-in customers, so it can become more like a commercial retail uses. So that's my thought. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Seow. GM Hall, I saw you trying to catch my attention there. Did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
Thank you, Chair. I just I wanted to offer further comment to the excellent question from Director Seegers and the comments from Manager Jackson about how we communicate about development opportunity. Just to say that there are lots of things that cannot be spelled out in a zoning bylaw or even in an official community plan, although there could be general policy about supporting innovation and creativity and community compatible new kinds of things. But just to say that staff are actively working on website renewal, and so the opportunity to build capacity amongst those who have excellent development ideas but maybe aren't experienced with working with the ins and outs of land use bylaws, have some starting point information about the kinds of proposals that could be brought forward. And so that work is happening, and that's aligned with our overall strategic plan goal of supporting community engagement and communication. Thanks.
Thank you, GM Hall. I'm going to keep going through my speakers list here. Director McMahon.
This is one of those days that I feel like I should have gotten a planning degree to take on this role. On the other hand, I'm Joe Public trying to understand all of this. So I can have compassion for all the other people who are trying to understand this. There's two things that I think that we do need to nail down before we leave this topic. One is the poultry and bunnies. And the other one is how we're going to clarify how we're bringing our APCs into this process. I just had a peripheral question because I'm still trying to understand how all these various pieces fit together. So I assume that there is some other bylaw or regulation that tells us how we handle things like development permit applications or development variance applications, because one thing that's come up quite a bit is the requirements for notice and the distance. So that, I assume, is part of another piece that's coming somewhere down the road.
I saw some head nodding over there. I don't know if anybody wants to, chime in for the record, but.
Thank you for the question. Yes, we do have Bylaw 522, our procedures bylaw, that stipulates many of these requirements as how we handle the various types of planning applications, including development variance permits. We also have an internal development planning procedures manual, which we're currently working on updating and will certainly be robustly updated through our PEP 1 project, the Planning Enhancement Projects 1, which looks at the development approvals processes. As well, there's also Local Government Act requirements, which actually stipulate certain conditions around referrals and timing and things like this. So there is those regulations that are in place, but we are looking at how we do things and how we can do them better and more efficient. And that's part of the development approvals process review that we'll be looking at. As one of the things that I mentioned actually was the province's more recent changes to the Local Government Act that will allow for consideration of staff-approved minor development variance permits, I should add. So things are changing. The province is looking at how we can do things more quickly and better, but yet still allow for some level of consultations. In some cases, for example, with a public hearing, if it's waived, there's still a mail-out. People are still notified. It's just it sort of leans the scope down for public hearings where and I know there's one on the agenda today, that's requested to be waived, where we know that it meets the OCP. We've heard from the community through a mail out, and we know it's the right thing to do. That particular process has been already accepted by the community through the official community plan, and there's sort of no point putting it through a longer drawn out process. So there's these options, and we'll continue to look at them as we do the development approvals process, and you'll hear more from us on that in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Pratt.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the question, the last question that Director Seegers brought out about home-based businesses, the art crawl, and then I have a few other questions regarding employees, because if you're running a farm or something like that, you're going to have probably more than two non-resident employees. And I also know anecdotally about a number of other businesses that already operate in the rural areas with more than two non-resident employees. If we do any tweaks to those, would that be considered a change in use at this point, or a change in density, or can that be something that maybe we look at after public hearing? Because there's been a lot of changes that have been made to cleaning up the language and clarifying some things around home-based businesses, and some that I'm not necessarily, I'm kind of gritting my teeth at, but I'm wondering, getting that wider public feedback from a public hearing might be the place before any decision or further cleanup of that is done. So I hope that, sorry, I went in a roundabout again.
Is this one of the things that we can amend after the public hearing process before adoption without triggering another public hearing?
Thank you for the question. Another good question. Number of employees, the home-based business would be the use. The number of employees would be a condition of that use and how you conduct it. It's certainly something that could be looked at if there was that sort of demand. I would add that as a sort of thing that probably well fits the purpose of a development variance permit. If somebody wants to have a business that involves potentially, more than two employees, it means more traffic to the home. It sort of gets back to that piece about what is residential versus commercial, and the line can get blurred pretty quick. So we've seen that in our research as well. A lot of local governments we looked at actually only allow one employee. So it is sort of a balancing act there, and that's sort of where we landed on the two. It seemed to be a sort of a generous piece. And also I'd add to that when it comes to agricultural pieces, if someone has got a farm use, that actually would basically null and void our requirement for a home-based business. It's not a home-based business, it's a farm use. And so they're allowed to conduct their use as a farm in that case. There's a whole bunch of other provincial legislation around how that thing can be implemented. So not a big concern with those particular ones, but for those, for example, if somebody wants to, have a workshop of sorts, if they have 10 employees versus 2 employees, there's sort of the thought process and it's best practice that there's normally a cap on the number of employees to sort of keep it within a residential scope. So this is just where we've landed, but it is a condition of use that could be looked at throughout the process as we chart forward. And again, it's something that, would certainly be a conditional consideration of a development variance permit as to whether or not it changed the scope of the business beyond residential. Would be the sort of things you would see in a report to the board for consideration of a development variance permit of that nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Follow-up, Director Pratt, or should I come back to you?
Well, I guess a quick follow-up, because there might be some explicitness that needs to be handled a little bit in this, because it's possible to have non-resident employees that, and I know with not doing business licensing, it makes things a lot more gray than what we would like, than, the little better exact nature, but because some employees might be working remotely, but so does this restrict them? So, if you have a home-based occupation or home-based business, and it's just, I know a number of these businesses that already operate in the rural areas on the Sunshine Coast. And they definitely have more than two. It's within someone's home and or property, and there's more than two non-resident employees. So we have a number that already do this. But I'm also at the point, it's like, I'd like to test this in front of the public, so.
Okay, thank you. Director Lee.
Thank you, Chair. I guess a comment on what Director Pratt I was just saying, and I had that as an example of, I'm not sure if this is OCP changes rather than bylaw updates, so that's kind of my question. For instance, if I happen to be a building contractor and I have a garage that when it's raining, we do projects in them, and I could have a dozen employees and still do work in my garage. It wouldn't be allowed under this, as near as I can tell. So I'm kind of in favor of mixed use so that you can do those kind of things, but I guess that's an OCP change. That would be my first comment on that. And so would that be something we would do after adoption of a zoning bylaw, if that's what we wanted to do? That's one question. Can I have two questions? Get that one answered and then go for another one?
Go for it, Director Lee.
Okay, thank you. Comments on that one?
Oh, okay. Manager Jackson, or?
I can start out, and I might, I feel like there was almost a 1A and 1B in there in terms of what would be permitted and then when the timing would come. I'll take the timing one and then turn it over to Senior Planner Xiao for the actual analysis of your proposed business. So in terms of the consideration of whether some sort of new zone is needed that would look at mixed use areas for possible, enhanced home-based business, like live work almost sort of zoning, if you will. That certainly would chart the waters of getting into OCP territory. It's a change of use that's not outright residential. Typically, you'll see that sort of developed in specific nodes and areas where you're anticipating that there's going to be an agglomeration of services, if you will, that also accommodate living. So it's often done in neighborhood centers in a lot of more urban areas. That doesn't mean that that has to be the only way that it happens, but it's certainly OCP level conversation to sort of get into something that's a different flavor than we currently have in the OCPs and the zoning bylaws they are today. And then I'll turn it over to Senior Planner Xiao just in relation to sort of how the interpretation of the non-resident employees would work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. So if the number of employees exceeds what the zoning bylaw allow as it was proposed in the draft, so yeah, so then the use would not be the condition will not be consistent with what the zoning bylaw permits. So it used to be a permitted use called home office, which allow people to run their, say, for a contractor to run the business from home. But the case that Director Lee mentioned is different. So it's about having employees that's not related to the property owner to working within the property. So that is not permitted by the zoning bylaw as it's written.
Thank you. Director Lee.
So under the proposed bylaw 722, if that was to occur, a bylaw complaint could be put in and that would have to be stopped. Do I have that right?
That's my understanding, but...
Yes, that's right.
Okay. My second question is, I see several suggestions from the public about concerns around RVs being used as a second dwelling on property, or RVs not being allowed to be used as a second dwelling on property. And there's mentions of safety issues, setbacks. And really what they're saying is that the RV isn't just being stored on the property until it's going to be used next. It's used as another either short-term or long-term dwelling. And it could be by the residents, relatives of the residents of the home, the residents of the home themselves, I guess, like sons and daughters. Is that something, if we wished, if the directors wish to address it, would be done in 722, or is that something that would have to be done through an OCP, or how would you address something like that if you wanted to address it?
Just before I go to staff, I am going to caution, because we've had the conversation before about long-term dwelling versus accommodation, because RVs are not dwellings, because that's a provincial building code descriptor. I get what you're trying to say. I just wanted to make sure I made that clarification before I went to staff.
Sorry, just to clarify, the reason I bring it up is simply because it's been brought up during the hearings. So are we going to answer it? That was my question.
Thank you. Certainly a pressing question in the community, and one that staff have, done our hardest to take a compassionate approach to, but recognizing that the toolkit that we've been handed down from the province at this time doesn't give us a latitude to consider RVs and mobile vehicles of any sort as dwellings. So Bylaw 722, it's certainly outside of its scope. It even gets above and beyond our official community plans. The good news is that as we get into our official community plans, that's really the sort of time to have those really bigger conversations about what sort of community do we want to be, how do we want to grow, what sort of housing forms do we want to see on the ground that ultimately give folks a dignified life and ability to live their lives with safe shelter. So certainly some of those conversations I know have been elevated to the provincial level. So we'll see what happens there and how things unroll. But that's certainly a larger process that goes beyond just our local government, and something that is definitely beyond the scope of Bylaw 722, but certainly something that staff will keep an eye on and a finger on the pulse to see how regulations continue to evolve. Thank you.
Thank you. Good answer.
All right, I've got a couple of directors here that are borderline revolting, so I think we better take a break. Is 7 minutes enough? And come back at 11:50? Oh. This is on you, Director McMahon. Go ahead, Director Seegers.
Okay, so I'm hearing lots of bits and pieces in this zoning bylaw. We're never going to have a perfect zoning bylaw. We're not going to pass a perfect zoning bylaw in September, even if we look at all of these other pieces that come forward. And we know that once it's passed, we're going to be revising it. So, I mean, I think we want to get to a place where we're comfortable taking something forward to the community and moving that forward. So, on the break, I'd like directors to look at what are you comfortable changing now in the bylaw to take it to public hearing, because some of these have bigger conversations that need to go with them. And what could you revisit after the zoning bylaw is done, so we can allow for that bigger conversation. And then let's see if we can move this forward after the break. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll come back at 11:55. And welcome back to the Electoral Area Services Committee for July 21st, 2022. Director McMahon, I see your hand up.
Right, sorry. Okay, I had a further question, which is on page 172. The definition of campground I see has been updated, but it doesn't make any mention of the physical layout, I guess, of the campground. What is a campground? Does it have camping sites? Does it have parking pads? Does it have, there aren't any clear requirements around there. Was that looked at? Is there an opportunity there? That's been a subject of some contention in my area.
And then a follow-up question to go with that was, did we make any requests to have staff look at the parameters that make up a campground as part of this process?
I can start out, and I'm probably going to pass it to Senior Planner Xiao on this one, as he's got a bit more history in this particular provision. Certainly, we recognize that there's been a number of concerns around campgrounds and ones going up, and you know, there's certainly onuses on folks that they are required by VCH to do proper sewage disposal, for example. That is another body of governance that's taking care of that. So that's outside of our processes. So I just add that because that is one of the concerns that we do here. I know this definition was intended to clearly sort of ensure that the temporary wording was in there and defining what we meant by that. So there's been a few tweaks made to it from previous, but I'll turn it over to Senior Planner Xiao for a little bit more background. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. So it is generally not the intent of the zoning bylaw to be too prescriptive on the design and layout of a site. So if a particular design outcome is desired, so it could be done through a forms and character development permit for certain designated areas. Thanks.
Director McMahon?
I'm still trying to get my head around this. So there are campgrounds, there are RV parks, and there are manufactured home parks. Are those defined in the OCPs, or are they in the zoning bylaw?
I can start out, and I'm sure Senior Planner Xiao may have a little bit more to add. In terms of the bylaw itself, the campground is referring to temporary uses, so there is the 30 days in there that refers to that. That's in keeping with provincial legislation around rental tenancies and when that requirement kicks in. Manufactured homes are separately identified in here as a definition, and they actually directly refer to the specific categories that are referred to through, I believe it's BC Building Code and the Canadian Standards Association for Manufactured Homes. So there's a specific reference to that there to ensure that when we say mobile or manufactured home, I should say, what do we mean by it? So it's very specific, and that definition has been updated to be current and make sure that it's referring to all the latest regulations that somebody would be looking to utilize if they were looking to place a manufactured home on their property. And I'll turn over to Senior Planner Xiao in case there's some additional comments there. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on to it. Manufactured home parks do not allow RVs or tents. And those by tents and RVs are usually permitted in a campground, not a manufactured home park. So there's a difference between these two type of uses.
Thank you. Director McMahon? You're the only one with your hand up, Director McMahon. Oh, Director Lee.
I'm not sure I understood the answer. I could use a little more clarification. And I'll tell you where my head is on this. Subdivisions have layouts and amenities and setbacks and all that stuff, and Modi checks and makes sure all that's done and puts referrals to all the right agencies to make sure it happens. I can't find anything about manufactured home parks or campgrounds, RVs and campgrounds, that do the similar thing. So my question is there such a thing that we know of? And if we wanted to do it, would that be an OCP or a zoning issue?
Good question. Definitely gets into the nature of how complicated sort of managing these existing zoning rights are. So there are many properties, especially with the rural land use zones, that permit campgrounds when they're over a certain size, and there is some, I believe it's 10 sites per hectare that is allowed when they have hit that trigger where they're permitted to have a campground. That's something that's been in the bylaw as long as I've been able to trace back, so it is something that we've inherited from 310. There's some further clarifications around timing and the temporary use that were always intended before in terms of intent, but they are more clearly laid out in terms of their wording in this updated definition. Looking at doing some sort of prescriptive sort of, maximum pad size of 10 square meters or something like that, it's certainly something that could be within the wheelhouse of a zoning bylaw requirement. Whether it's through a definition or a condition of use, probably would be the more appropriate place to put it within a zone itself where it's permitted. Something that staff could monitor. I don't believe we had specific direction at the time of the bylaw to look at something of that nature, but it's not out of the wheelhouse of future considerations, whether it's as part of this bylaw or something that we would consider as part of future housekeeping, bearing in mind too that it may actually be bigger and more of a regional matter than it is just 722. It might go into both 337 and 722. In terms of official community plans, though, there may be other parameters depending on the objectives of what we're looking for, or even a development permit area may be something that might be a consideration that we could have. For example, if the intent is to try and protect the natural environment and ensure that these things aren't sort of turned into parking lots, if you will, that's certainly something that a development permit area could be considered for, which then that would be, currently our development permit areas are within our official community plans, so that would then be OCP amendment work at that point. Hope that helps to answer it. I'm not sure if Senior Planner Sal has anything further to add.
Yes, so I just want to mention that the zoning bylaw is not a good tool to regulate design-related matters. So in general practice, many other municipalities have called urban design guidelines or design guidelines that works alongside with the OCP. So that will allow some flexibilities in design rather than to be very prescriptive on the layout of the site. So I would suggest that may be a better tool to consider.
Thank you for that. Director Lee?
I believe that answers my question. Yes, thank you. It doesn't need to be done now.
Thank you.
That's actually my question. So
Okay.
thank you.
All right. Director McMahon, I see your hand up. Good.
Yeah, basically what Director Lee said. This is something I want to pursue, but I can see that now is not the time. Let's move along with this bylaw, and I'll be back, though.
Okay. Thank you, Director McMahon. Just before I've got a couple of recommendations based on the conversation to add to this list. But one thing that we do need to identify is a director for the chair and a director for the alternate chair for the public hearing. So who would be interested? Director Pratt?
I would be interested, however, will the public hearing be in person or will it be via Zoom?
Thank you, Director Pratt. I meant to ask that question, if it was going to be Zoom or hybrid or in person. I imagine it's going to be a pretty large affair. GM Hall?
Thank you, Chair. Staff are contemplating electronic for the benefit of easy access. If there's a desire to have it be hybrid, that can be arranged. Thanks.
Okay. Director Pratt?
I'm happy to volunteer as chair for this.
Okay. Director Seegers?
Then I'm happy to put my name forward as vice chair.
All right. Okay. Well, that took care of that. So, we do have recommendations on page 1. And the recommendations that I have, I think right after the first, that would be, we would be adding, and that references to chickens be amended to poultry and rabbits, with exceptions continued for roosters. And that the revised zoning bylaw number 722 be considered for second reading. And that a public hearing be arranged to consider zoning bylaw number 722. And further, that Director Pratt be delegated as the chair and Director Seegers be delegated as the alternate chair for the public hearing. And that this report be referred to APCs and the OCPC for, to support their involvement in the public hearing process or for future consideration. So that's what I've got for recommendations, which I can't make. So is anybody willing to make those recommendations?
I will.
Oh, okay, thank you, Director Pratt. Do I have a seconder? I do have a seconder. Any other discussion on the recommendations? Director Ties?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, that's the Roberts Creek OCPC, and that, yeah. And I wonder if staff has any comments on the wording of how that referral to the APCs and OCPC is constructed. Is that good? Okay.
This wording came from staff, so I hope they're good with it. Director Lee? Microphone.
Typically from our municipalities, they ask for a referral to them. I'm wondering if that's necessary in this instance.
I think that's already been done.
Thank you.
All right. Director Seegers?
Yes, so we're changing chickens is what so bees is still in there? Is what
Yes.
I'm hearing. Okay, perfect, thank you.
Yep. All right. I don't see any other hands. Director Hiltz?
Are you going to need a definition for poultry now?
Manager Jackson?
I looked it up.
Anticipating some of these questions today, it had already been a discussion point with staff, so we have looked at some of that. I think they're pretty commonplace out there. I heard some good suggestions earlier today during recess as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think the intent is to get it moving forward. We won't spend too much time wordsmithing the bylaw. I don't see any other hands up, so I will call the question. Rural directors, all those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you very much. And that gets us through Annex A at 12:10. So moving on to Annex B. I don't see any other hands up, so we're going to move on from this. Moving on to Annex B, zoning amendment bylaw number 310.195, 2022 for 562 Veterans Road. Consideration of first, second, and third readings and adoption. Turn this over to Mr. Copes.
Thank you, Chair. The purpose of this zoning amendment application is to change the subdivision district of the parcel from F to D to permit a two-lot subdivision. The applicant has conducted a preliminary public consultation and the application was referred to the Elphinstone APC. Local residents and the APC expressed the desire for a trail to be constructed to connect Hoff Road, which is supported by the SCRD Parks Department. Staff recommend that a public hearing not be held and that the zoning amendment be given first, second, and third readings and adoption, subject to conditions including notification, MODI approval, and covenant registration.
All right, thank you very much. Director McMahon.
Just a quick question. I thought we'd already passed this. It's been in the works for quite a while. Did it get hung up for any particular reason?
Thank you for the question. There has been ongoing negotiation and discussion for the last few months with the Parks Department in regards to the desire for a trail.
Okay. Thank you. I don't see any other hands up. Director McMahon?
Yes, I'd like to move the recommendations on page 339.
And that's been seconded. Thank you very much. I don't see any other hands up, so I will call the question. Rural directors, all those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you very much. And moving on to Annex C, Agricultural Land Commission Application 64280, SCRD ALR 00016. Turn this over to Planner Ms. Clark.
Good morning, directors. I guess it's good afternoon. The CRD received this referral from the Agricultural Land Commission regarding an application seeking retroactive approval for a non-farm use, specifically for removal of soil and placement of fill at 1088 Chamberlain Road in Area F, West Howe Sound. A CRD board recently reviewed and denied a non-farm use referral from ALC for a retroactive, non-conforming commercial storage facility development on this property that contravened both SCRD bylaws and ALC legislation. This follow-up application seeks to retain the fill that was placed under the non-conforming development, also without ALC authorization. Staff are recommending forwarding this application to the ALC for decision, with the comment that you see in the recommendation that based on the information provided, the proposal to retain the unauthorized fill does not comply with SCRD, Agricultural Area Plan, Regional District Sustainability Plan, or the West Howe Sound OCP. This approach utilizes the mandate and the expertise of the ALC and responds to the lack of an SCRD bylaw regulating the placement of fill or the removal of soil. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Directors. Director Hiltz, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, and thanks, staff, for the recommendations. I'm good with the recommendations. It seems a reasonable one. My only question is the reference to the plans, are those included as part of the package that goes to the ALC?
Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. Usually the plans are not referred on in their entirety. So the intent of including those three in the recommendation is as a reference, not with the particulars of each of the policies.
Thank you. Director Seegers.
Thank you. If this gets passed, who's responsible for enforcement? Is that the regional district or is it the ALC? Because basically what we'd be saying is the structure that's on there and the fill would need to be removed. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll note that SCRD has already been referred the application for the structure, and that was denied. So the question today is about the fill that's underneath the structure. When SCRD denies the application process stops, does not get forwarded on, to the Agricultural Land Commission for their own decision. What staff are recommending here is that ALC has the mandate and the authority to decide about the fill in a way that SCRD does not, and that it's at this point best decided by them. Either way, the enforcement mandate is with the Agricultural Land Commission.
Okay. Okay. Director Hiltz.
No other questions. I'll move the recommendations as presented on 347.
Thank you, and I've got lots of seconders for that, so I don't see any other hands up. I will call the question. Rural Directors, all those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you very much. We've already dealt with Annex D, so now we're moving on to Annex E, page 364 in our agenda package, and this is over to GM Rosenboom. Welcome to the meeting.
Thank you again. So I prepared several slides as an introduction to this report. I thought it would be helpful for the discussion. So I'll share my screen and we go from there. There we go. Oh, let's start at this first slide. So this report is for the board's consideration, for the committee's consideration, and is a result from earlier direction provided by the board to review Bylaw 320 with a focus on the provisions in the current bylaw on SRD taking over larger community water systems. So the current situation is that those systems over 22.7 cubes a day with a flow of effluent flow of over 22.7 are regulated by Ministry of Environment, and smaller systems are regulated by Vancouver Coastal Health. There's currently no legal requirement for local governments to own or operate any of those systems, not the smaller ones, not the larger ones. The subdivision servicing bylaw 320 currently states that the SRD would automatically take over any of the systems over 22.7 cubes a day, and that it could take over any other systems as it desires. It sets currently, it includes for currently a very limited amount of criteria that needs to be met by a developer before the SRD will take it over. So what are the concerns staff have identified with the current approach? There's no consideration from the long-term regulatory compliance of the systems. We see that several of the systems that we've taken over last 10, 15 years are having ongoing compliance issue that could have been avoided if the takeover by the SRD would have been differently, under different terms and conditions. And there is no consideration at the time of takeover currently for future asset management requirements for any of the systems. And there are no requirements for operational and capital plans. As a result, we're currently trying to, and you're all aware of that, trying to get a lot of these systems in a better position, but that's challenging. So the day-to-day results is that we have ongoing performance issues with several of these of the current facilities due to insufficient flow into the system. And we have insufficient operational and capital funding to support sustainable service delivery now and moving forward. So the report outlines three options for the board's consideration. The first one is to amend Bylaw 320 such that the board has to make a decision on the takeover of every large water system. So currently it's an automatic takeover, and it would be under option one, a decision by the board. And staff would support a board decision by developing an application process, an application guide for developers to follow, so that we can make proper, adequate recommendations to the board. Option two would maintain the current approach and consider any amendments as part to the bylaw as part of a comprehensive review that will be undertaking next year, and it might result in amendments to be brought forward next year or early the year after. Or option three would amend Bylaw 320 such that larger water system, community sewer systems are not automatically be taken over by the SRD, and that developers also don't have to request the SRD to take it over. So it's still optional for the SRD to take it over, but there is no need to apply anymore, which would be the case with option one. Option one, every developer would have to come to the SRD and say, do you want to take this over or not? And option three would be, it's totally up to the developer if they want the SRD to consider it or not. Staff are recommending option one because it would be most easy to implement and would allow for community values to be protected as and when needed. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, GM Rosenboom. And I see Director McMahon.
Yes, I'm very supportive of option one, but just looking for some clarification here. How will this affect developments that have already been approved and are in the pipeline and are being built out on the assumption that the SCRD was going to take this on?
Thank you for the question. It totally depends on what you're considering to be approved. If there is a subdivision already approved, then it's a different story. But we're currently having some initial discussions with developers on subdivisions that are even in a very early stage. Some of them have not even formally submitted their application yet, even not to us in terms of wastewater. So those would be subject to this new regime once the bylaw is adopted.
All right, Director Ties.
Yes, I see a whole lot more hands up, but I am more than happy to move the recommendations on page 364.
All right, and I see seconder for that. I do still have the speakers list, so I will keep going. Director Seegers.
Thank you. Looking at these, I understand you'd be setting up the parameters, etc. And it's saying focus on identifying any potential to the community and the environment and the sustainable service delivery for these systems if the SCRD would take them over, is what you're saying under option one. The requirement for whether or not they're fulfilling the environmental guidelines, etc., are not ours. They're VCH or MOE, depending on the size of the facility or the service. Why would we want to take on that requirement? I mean, would that not be up to VCH or MOE to enforce if it's not being maintained? Why would we want to step in and take that on? That's their job, right? That's kind of the way I look at it. So, I mean, I'm wondering why we would even consider doing that. And I know for developments that are in process right now, if they're looking at putting in some kind of community sewer system, they could set up a strata that would provide the service and be managed by the people. So if they get the charge by MOE and have to pay a fine, they have to pay the fine. And so they're going to have to make sure that they have the funds to maintain the system that they're building and they're buying into. So why would we want to get in the middle of this?
Thank you for the question. I still had it on and it turned off instead of on. It's best practice, as indicated in the report. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing is recommending that the SRD considers taking systems on that, if they are not managed properly, could result in significant, for example, environmental impacts. And that could, for example, also create a nuisance to neighbors. If there is a discharge field, septic field, that's not maintained properly, yes, there might be a non-compliance, but at the same time, there could be a lot of nuisance to neighbors. So those kind of considerations could be taken into account by the SRD separately from the Ministry of Environment's own consideration. And I think I agree with you, it's in a way augmenting, I would see it more as augmenting the responsibility of MOE than taking it over.
Okay, thank you for that. Director Hiltz.
Yeah, thanks for the report. Yeah, and I am supportive as well. So one of my question is, this will become an application process, which will require staff time to review the applications, and we're concerned about cost recovery. So will there be a fee and charge related to this application brought before the board for consideration in the future? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. My fellow GM is is laughing. We currently staff are currently spending a significant amount of time on each of these plans, regardless of an application, formal application process being in place or not. And actually, there's currently already an application process in place, and developers are under Bylaw 320 already paying for cost. A majority of the costs that we're spending on applications, that's currently already part of the 320. So we're currently having a moment in time when formal plans are being submitted, then we start the clock, and then we start billing. And as part of this process, we'll also refine that and communicate that better to residents, to developers. Thank you.
If your follow-up is 3 minutes or less, otherwise
Definitely.
I need a motion to extend the meeting. In that case, can I have a motion to extend the meeting past 3 hours? Moved, seconded, all those in favor? Thank you very much. Now you can go ahead, Director Hiltz.
Just to, so right now, the cost recovery is already, there's a process and okay, so that's what I was, that's clear in my mind. Thank you.
And maybe if I can add, Chair, I think this process, having an application guide would actually streamline the process and even make it more efficient. Or at least that's also the intent from our perspective, to do a lot of the upfront work instead of that we have ongoing discussions with developers about the criteria for us to take it over.
Go for it.
So the follow-up is, it's essentially an operational procedure which you're developing. We went through this policy thing yesterday, some kind of policy procedures. Are we talking staff? So this would be a staff operating policy procedure. So will the board see that procedure before it becomes adopted by staff, or just some comments of, like, is it out of our lane and totally operational, or if you could say something about that. Thanks.
Thank you. The current intent from staff is that it will be an operational guide to developers so that we receive the information to make the best recommendation to you. If you want it to include certain criteria for them to be met, because otherwise you will not even consider them, that's a different discussion. But we are currently focusing on it to be an operational guide that has, so that we have all the information that we need to provide a good recommendation to the committee, to the board. And the long-term plan would be to refine them over time and potentially consider them for inclusion in the Bylaw 320 amendments next year. And because then we work through some, we refine them and improve them, and then they can be considered as part of the bylaw.
Okay, thank you. Director McMahon.
I wanted to know who's in charge of inspecting these facilities to make sure that they are built to the standards that they're supposed to be built. If we take the hypothetical case of a plant that we took over that doesn't work properly, and we finally end up having to dig the thing up and then discover that it was never built properly, whose fault is that, and how can we ensure that that's just not happening anymore?
Unfortunately, it's not a hypothetical example that you're providing there, because it's a real example. I think that's part of the process that I foresee, that staff foresees, is that we would have a third-party inspector. A third party that we would connect with a third-party wastewater engineer to inspect the works before we take it over, because our staff do have some skills in that, but I think a third party would be more appropriate there.
So we can make that a requirement.
All right. I don't see any other hands up. We do have our motion on the floor. So I will call the question. Rural or electoral area directors, all those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you very much. Moving on to Annex F. Planning and Development Department 2022 Q2 report. GM Hall.
Thank you, Chair. So every quarter, the Planning and Development Department brings forward a summary of activity in the last quarter. So staff are pleased to present this today. And we have managers of each of the divisions with us if there are questions or further information that staff can provide. Thank you.
Thank you, GM Hall. Just before I go to my speakers list, I did want to say thank you for the report. Greatly appreciate the pictures. Seeing what's going on, what our protective services are up to, it's great. This report gets better every time we see it. So, Director Ties.
Yes, thank you. I want to speak to the planning and bylaw issues that, or especially the bylaw issues on page 765, bottom bullet. I'm just wondering if there's a way that we can resource the bylaw department better while at the same time increasing the penalties dealt out to pay for the better resourcing. So I feel like, you know, we need to really help our bylaw department out by giving it the right resources, but then at the same time, the fines I find are still not proportional to the amount of work that they need to do. And I think there should be some recouping of the costs of increasing the resourcing of the bylaw department by increasing the fine. So that's something that I would like to see in the future. And so that's just my comment on that one.
All right. Director McMahon.
Yeah, that was my concern too, as a matter of fact. I've been trying to figure out a way to politely, tell people who are coming at me with persistent bylaw complaints that are not perhaps life-threatening, that their bylaw issue is not as important as some of these other files we have, but I know that that's not going to be taken at all well, given that there are chicken wars going on in my neighborhood. So anything that we can do to help with this, I don't know. We'd like to do that. Thank you.
GM Hall.
Thank you, Chair. As a brief comment back on the former comments, staff are still working on the board's direction to take a look at our bylaw enforcement policy with an eye to streamlining it and providing discretion that respects community needs but provides efficiency. And so I thank you for your continued interest and support, and we will be bringing forward some work on that in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Lee.
Hang on, I'm trying to figure out how to put my hand down here. I got this all messed up. I had a comment on bylaw enforcement and philosophy, and I suspect that GM Hall is going to include that in the report. But in my opinion, compliance is the most important single thing in a lot of these messy properties. Clean them up, RVs where they shouldn't be. We need to clean it up so that the neighborhood becomes, I was going to say respectful, but that isn't correct. But the way that the neighborhood chooses to be under the OCP, the rural character, and still acceptable to everybody. And I think compliance is probably the most important. And I think also the role that our professional bylaw officers take on when they take on a file, they engage the other levels of government, and they're very effective in getting things fixed by using all the resources. So I don't think of fines as a way of recouping costs, unfortunately. I think of fines as something that would encourage compliance and quite a effective tool, because it could be more expensive to not do it than to clean up your property or fence it off or whatever you need to do. So those are my comments that I think we need to think about when we're talking about bylaw compliance. And I'm hoping we have enough officers now to start working on the backlog, but hopefully we'll start seeing statistics that tell us. But this is pretty new. We haven't had the bylaw officers in place for long, and my sense is that they're making good progress right now. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you, Director Lee. Director Hills.
Thanks, Chair. And yeah, I'm going to second love the pictures. Just, it's nice to see color in these reports too. It's just, so I'm on page 771. It's about the David Mitchell and Associates meeting. So the question is, I'm thinking of in the Gibsons area, we're thinking of an expansion of the fire protection area. So if you could just sort of fill in a little bit about what prompted the discussion, and if you can say anything about results about what's happened so far with the response times. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Fortunately, we have both our Manager of Protective Services and our Chief Building Official here who are equal parties to that work and can share some further details, please.
So who wants to go first? Manager Trite?
Sure, thank you. So the 10-minute response time with regards to Dave Mitchell was initiated by the building department, and it has to do with when you build outside of a area which can be responded to within 10 minutes by the fire department. There are different criteria involved in building, and I will let Mr. Whittleton speak to those. So as we were pursuing that, the idea was trying to determine realistically what a 10-minute response time would look like from each of our fire halls, and how we would go about determining what that 10-minute area would be, keeping in mind that as volunteer departments, there's no guarantee of who's going to show up, particularly, say, during the regular working hours of the day. So first step we took, we went with Mr. Mitchell. We went over some statistics on response times, and from there we're going to decide what route we're going to go as far as determining what our 10-minute response time would look like, and if it's worth pursuing mapping that out from our fire halls, or if we're just going to stay with the position that because we're volunteer fire halls and there's no guarantees, that we'll just assume that there could potentially be a 10-minute, more than a 10-minute response to any location, in which case the stricter building requirements would apply. And certainly if Mr. Whittleton has anything to add, or I could answer any questions you have as well.
Thank you for that. Mr. Whittleton, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I can elaborate a little bit on the building code requirements. This has, in regards to fire safety for sure, but the distance from a property line to the building determines how many windows you can have in it. And the response time of less than 10 minutes is less restrictive than an area where the response time is more than 10 minutes. The number of windows you can have is greatly reduced. There are other options for homeowners or builders when they do want more windows when they're in a restricted area. They can put fire sprinklers in the building. There are some mechanical shutters they can use. There are other methods, but most of them have a significant cost. So if we can determine where that area is, we may be able to reduce some of the restrictions on some of the areas or properties that are within the 10-minute response time.
Thank you for that. That was very, very well explained. It makes a lot of sense to me. Director Seegers.
Thank you. On page 764, there's information about the regional growth strategy. And I know there's been a lot of work happening behind the scenes, and there has been a community group that has had involvement, but I'm starting to hear from the community, they like to know what's happening. We don't know what's happening. We haven't had a report to us about, yes, we're gathering data, we know that. But what does that mean? At what point is something going to be coming out to the community for community involvement and their, the broader engagement? Because what I read in here is that MODIS has started work on the final phase 3 report, including mapping the potential growth areas. So is that not something that we need more community input on, or is that once they're mapped, that would be the stage that would happen? So I'm just looking at how do we get engagement and buy-in on something like this?
Great question. Manager Jackson.
Yes, good question. Thank you for it. There's a few phases here, first of all, in terms of the regional growth baseline versus a potential future regional growth strategy. So there's different bars and sort of milestones for public consultation, but there will be upcoming public consultation related to this research that's been done by MODIS. I believe we mentioned it earlier in the meeting as well. Sorry, I just turned my camera on here. Realized I turned it off. That we're also working on getting our development application web pages up and out. And this would be one of those examples, just like with 722, where there will be a application web page for it, even though it's an SCRD application, just like zoning bylaw 722. We found it a really effective tool using Bang the Table for application web page to really communicate with the public, give opportunity for input. It's a really dynamic resource that we now have at our fingertips to use. So that is all in the works for the regional growth baseline. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Seegers.
Thank you. Page 770. Third last bullet says, contracts have been awarded for energy studies on decarbonizing Seashelt Aquatic Center, Gibson's and Area Community Center, and Sunshine Coast Arena. I don't really know what that means. And then I also don't see anything in here regarding solar panels, because I know we've been working with the Solar Association to, add solar panels, etc. So I'm wondering if you could address those two.
Thanks, and I'd be pleased if Manager Shea could share some information, please.
Thank you for the question, Chair. The decarbonization projects was a project funded through the 2022 budget and involves energy studies on how natural gas equipment at the rec centers, which is reaching end of life, could be switched over to electric, therefore reducing dramatically our emissions of our biggest emitters in the SCRD asset class. And then with regards to the Solar Association is completing some reports that they had started last year. They've also been supporting some of our other community partners with some solar and energy efficiency assessments. Staff expect to bring a summary of those reports as part of the directive for renewable energy strategy alongside the corporate carbon neutrality plan that's scheduled for Q4 of 2022.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. Just to further connect the dots there, the work of the Solar Association can be an input to those decarbonization studies. So the potential, the source of the electricity that might be used can be considered as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Director McMahon.
Yes, I'm enjoying the bylaw statistics on page 781 and noticing, of course, that the most offenders are in Area A, particularly if you consider per capita. But I'd be interested in future in a little bit of insight into how many of these files are like perpetual files. Like, so I assume that some of these complaints are resolved fairly quickly and others go on and on and on. I had a phone call yesterday from somebody in a neighbor dispute that's been going on for about 30 years and has resulted in I don't know how many bylaw complaints. There's probably a drawer full of them somewhere. But I'm just interested in, you know, what's the efficiency of it? Like how
Closure time?
yeah, closure time or how large these files are in terms of staff resources. Thank you.
I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that now. GM Hall?
Thanks. As a general comment, staff actually all across the organization, not just in planning and development, are doing some work on key performance indicator review and development. And the disposition of each of these, 19 files in electoral area A, to use one example, is something that we're actively looking at, as well as the possibility of introducing resolution time measures. Thanks.
Thank you. I imagine that could get tricky because if you've got a fairly low number of files, you could have one file just totally trash your metrics. So, Director Hiltz.
Thanks. Can I do two questions?
Go for it.
Okay. I think they're both pretty straightforward. On the 911 topic, that's on page 778. Recently in the news, there's been talk about the 988 mental health number that's been kind of rolled out in the U.S. and it's gaining momentum. So, do staff know if that discussion is happening through their contacts with the 911 service as an initiative that's coming this way? And the follow-up would be whether would the SCRD be part of that system, I guess. That's a bit of a hypothetical. So I guess more their current awareness about the mental health 988 number and implications to SCRD services. Thanks.
Who wants to take that? Manager Trite or?
Yeah, I mean, I could just comment that, any service provided through the 911 system, we would be a part of. As far as that specific one, I really don't have any information yet on it or what the impact would be. I just wanted to mention as well, I don't know that I answered the second part of Director Hiltz's other question about the expansion of fire protection areas. So if I'm able to just grab a moment here to do that, we are looking at that as a 2023 project, specifically in the area, in the Gibsons area. Because this is an election year, in speaking with corporate services, they just didn't have the capacity to pursue that this year, but it is still on our work plan for 2023.
Go ahead.
And the last one is it's the page 781. It's the Santix decision. It was related to the bylaw enforcement of dangerous dogs. And does this affect how SCRD deals with bad dogs? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, typically, if we have a dog that we determined or we believe to be dangerous or vicious, that's being pounded at the SPCA. The SPCA we tend to defer to their expertise as far as evaluating the animal, and also based on its past behavior. Obviously, there's a process for us to go through outlined in the community charter to have that dog destroyed if that's the route we want to go, and that's what we would follow. I mean, the Santec decision, as I understand it, was just a kind of a long, drawn-out court battle between the owner of an animal who felt it should not be destroyed, and obviously the authorities who thought it should be. So, I mean, ultimately, it comes to the courts decide if there is pushback. The courts would decide whether or not an animal would be destroyed, assuming that the owner was not in agreement, and we have seen that. Sometimes the owner agrees to have an animal put down after it's been assessed by the SPCA, after it's been involved in a violent incident, and been assessed by the SPCA as an animal that could not be adopted out to anyone else.
Thank you. Director Seegers.
Thank you. I have one comment and a request, and then a question. On page 778, partway through the page, it talks about after significant delay. It's talking about disaster financial assistance. I was on a call this last week with Minister Bill Blair from the federal government and Minister Norm Cullen from the province here. And they were it was on emergency preparedness. And conversations we've had with them, each are saying the other is requiring like-for-like replacement. And during the call with both of them on there, it was indicated that disaster financial assistance allows for 15% increase in cost to use some other method to provide more sustainability or future-proofing kind of things. But what I'm hearing from some of my colleagues, particularly with jurisdictions our area, is that 15% might not be enough of a lift to actually make the changes that we need to make. So I'd appreciate if you, when you're going through this, if you look at the 15% and find it isn't sufficient, or is, either way, I'd like some information back and I will feed it up the chain, because we may need to address some of that at a federal level to, because they do want, I mean, what they indicated is they do want to future-proof some of these repairs that we're doing. They don't want to have to come back and do them over and over again. But they seem to think that the 15% may be sufficient. I don't know that, okay? So that's the question they ask. Here's a question for you. Bottom of page 778 talks about 911 service upgrades. Given the presentations we've had from ECOM, et cetera, are these towers and the communication systems we're putting in, are they under the new standard for 911 ECOM that we've been taught, we've been told have to be implemented, or are we going to have to do some upgrades to these down the road? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So the towers themselves are being built to the industry standard. So they're all going to be to that standard. The communication will actually go through sort of the electronics, the antennas, repeaters, and so on those towers. And for the next gen 911 system, that communication equipment will be able to handle the next gen 911 system, which will be people reporting. So when you're calling in, you're at a traffic accident, you witnessed a traffic accident, you call that in, you're able to send the video and the pictures and so on to ECOM to provide that extra information. So our equipment will be able to handle that kind of reporting to ECOM. The paging itself will still remain as we do it now, at least for the foreseeable future, the way the fire departments and ambulance and so on are paged out. But yeah, the towers are being built to the industry standard, and the new equipment will be conducive to the next gen 911 system.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
That is very good news. Director Lee.
Yes, I was just wondering on the stats, for instance, Electoral Area A at 19 bylaw complaints. Is that actually property, or is that actually complaints against a property, or is that actually total forms filled out and sent in?
Thank you for the question. So those would be the number of complaints that led to files for Electoral Area A. So there may be there's often other inquiries, questions, and so on that are involved that don't involve opening of files. But that'd be the number of files new files that were opened during the second quarter for Area A.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Director Hiltz.
Yeah, this is congratulating and thanks to the outreach to Gambier Island and with regards to fire smarting, and the report that I got back is it was a good common sense approach about what you can do as an individual and when you need to run. Because in the past people have thought that you could fight a 30-meter wall of flames, but there is definitely times you need to run, and that became clear through that discussion. So it's very useful, and they appreciate the outreach. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Director McMahon.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on the bylaw thing. So that makes sense that that's the number of new files that opened, but it doesn't quite tell us the volume of complaints, because we could have had 30 complaints about one bylaw file. So yeah, just it'll be interesting to look at what metrics we can put together going forward. Maybe there could be an award for the most complaints on a single file. Thanks.
Thank you, Director McMahon. All right, I don't see any other hands up. So thank you for the report. And we're going to move on to our APC minutes, annexes G, H, I, and J, all at once. If there's anything that anybody would like to action, you need to pull it for discussion and voting. Director Hiltz?
Yeah, in the area F, there was about a comment, I'm not finding it now. Oh, it's recommendation number 3. It's about essentially keeping the APCs up to date on planning topics, which are now distributed through, could be up to 3 committees now. So so that it was how to keep the APCs informed of the other areas that they want to be informed, and how staff could actually do that now that they used to just forward the planning committee meeting or minutes, and now it's distributed. So have staff looked into how to distribute this information as it was before? They feel a loss, I guess. Thanks.
GM Hall?
Yeah, thank you. Staff took note of this, and we always want our volunteers to feel supported and informed, so we will take this away and figure out how best we can support them. There might be some questions back, but I'm confident we can restore the communication link so that they feel supported. Thanks.
But no specific action needed at this time on that.
Well, I mean, if the committee wishes to make a resolution, that's fine, but staff appreciate this as restoring something that is a standing practice, so I don't personally don't feel it's necessary. We'll make it better. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, GM Hall. Director Pratt?
Thank you. Area B had, on page 783, had a request. I'm wondering if staff would need to have that come forward as a recommendation for us, or if that's sufficient within the report from the APC minutes. They're asking that the SCRD provide a report of the RAR report and development permit records for Wood Bay Ridge subdivision, as well as for other subdivision applications in the future, just so they have some more context when these applications come forward to them.
Thank you for the question. Staff are working on a way to provide them with some information, but with recognition that this is a reliance model for the development permits for riparian areas, geotechnical considerations. So those reports are things that we can certainly provide. Like, I think in many cases they're actually many pages long. So providing synopsises and things like this might be something that we're going to look at to try and sort of give them what they need to make their decisions, but not give them a big, huge, complicated technical report that might not be in their wheelhouse. So we'll be looking at ways to communicate that information, one of which is actually back to the planning application web pages and thinking about the type of information that we put on those so that it's online and easily accessible for all, especially when it relates to these bigger subdivisions and rezonings and there's an associated development permit that goes with it versus, you know, somebody looking to build a shed in their backyard. There's certainly generate a little bit more community interest. So we're looking at designing our planning application web pages to take that into account. Thank you.
So at this time, you don't need this action by the board. It's already something that's under process.
I would feel comfortable that staff are currently working on a resolution to this to get the APCs what they need and help best support our volunteers.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other hands up, so I think that takes us to the end of our meeting. We have no communications. We have no in-camera session. So I will look for a motion to adjourn. Moved? Seconded. All those in favor? All right, we are adjourned. And I do see one hand up in our gallery here, so I will give you permission to speak.
Thank you. This, Chair, I assume you're referring to me, Peter Galbraith?
I am, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I have a question back to the Management of Community Sewer Systems report that is Annex E in the agenda. There was an attachment to that report which dates back to September 2020, which dealt with, if you will, another half of this issue, which is what would the process be for, I'll use a word, terminating the SCRD's involvement with existing community sewer areas. That has got pretty major ramifications, and I recognize the process that's laid out in that is relatively onerous. But my question is more procedural. Given that you have directed staff to proceed with the basic report that was presented by Manager Rosenboom today, does that also mean that you are taking explicit action related to the issue of changing the relationship on existing community services?
I would hypothesize not necessarily, but I don't know that we've really had that conversation here. Remco, did you want to weigh in on that at all? No?
No, I think the only, thank you for the question, Peter. I think the answer is, and Chair, I think that's a different issue. This is about new developments, new projects that are coming online, and what to do with the existing one there is, I think that's ultimately a board decision on what they want to do, and a community and a conversation with the users of those systems. And I think that's outside the scope of this report. And so far, staff have not received any direction to initiate any action there.
And I've got a couple of directors that want to weigh in as well. So Director Lee?
Thank you, Chair. I had received a question or two on that 2020 report, and I think it's the same question as Mr. Galbraith is asking. Would the SCRD initiate a process to fire the residents, I guess is what you would say? And if that, would it follow the same process as if the residents wanted to get out of contracting, let's say contracting us to look after the systems? So to be a little clearer, could the SCRD ask the residents if they want to get out and start a petition from them and say, hey, if 2/3 of you say this, then we'll give it back to you. So they initiate the process instead of the residents. I think that's probably the similar question to what Peter or Mr. Galbraith was asking.
Which I think is a little outside the scope of question and answer period at the end of the meeting after a long meeting, but
could I ask a clarification then? My concern at the moment is that the clear and tacit instruction to staff to proceed related to your rules regarding new systems, that in the minutes include a statement that it does not include starting a process related to existing systems. It seems to me there's a room there for confusion as to, because it's an integral part of that package. It's a really big deal.
Director Seegers?
Peter, I think what the report lays out is that there already is a process. So staff, directors weren't aware of what the process was, should either we or the community want to divest. And so all of that second report does, the attachment, is lay out what the process is that's already in place. So That's here for our information, it's for your information. At this point, all we're looking at doing is dealing with new systems going forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification.
You're welcome. Yeah, we've had no conversation about divesting existing systems at all. So, Director Pratt?
Yeah, and just as an additional note, I mean, in order to divest of a system, as that report lays out, it's really extensive, and there's a lot of community consultation that has to happen first, Peter. So it's not just a board motion that divests of a plant. It's a legislative process. So it's pretty intensive.
And that I realize. My concern is that is this the short end of a stick?
No. It's a very long stick, and there's no short end.
Okay.
That's my understanding of going forward. It's for systems going forward. It's not looking back at anything that's already there, in my way of thinking. And I think from other directors, we've heard that as well. It's a grandmothering in of systems. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question, and thank you for sticking with us for the whole meeting. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.